Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is second bite at the cherry in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 61. There were small vents in the rock, tiny holes that filtered in outside air to prevent any of Root's denizens from suffocating deep beneath the earth. As they headed further into the tunnel's depths, Shikamaru began to see light, integrated ceiling lamps that hadn't been damaged by the cave-in. They didn't appear to be attached to any electrical wiring, and Shikamaru couldn't help but passively wonder how Danzo had managed to hook them up. Root had to be off the city's main electrical grid, otherwise it would have risked civilians knowing the location. Had Root set up their own generators? Had they used lightning chakra in some way, storing it within seals to slowly power the lamps over time? If they survived this, Shikamaru decided he was going to petition Tsunade to let this be his new secret base. Nobody would bother him down here, it was dark and quiet, he could study how the lamps worked, and he'd earned a ridiculous reward for the amount of trouble he'd went through for this. The only problem was surviving. There was an eerie quiet to the tunnels, nothing from ahead of them, and no sounds indicating that there might be a multi-village war raging in the village above them. Shikamaru wondered if this was intentional, this quieting of the tunnels. Maybe there were seals somewhere that kept away outside noise, muffled the steps of those within. The silence was even a bit much for him, if he had to admit it. He preferred a silence that was dotted with the rustling of leaves and grass, the chirping of birds and the buzzing of insects. Not silence, just calm. Here in the unnatural silence, Shikamaru could easily see himself just losing it. No people, no nature, no noise. How had Root lived in these conditions? He thought of Sai, thought of what Sakura had told him about the boy and how he'd repressed his emotions, repressed his entire sense of self. Sai hadn't really been living at all, had he? Stop. Niji's voice rang out, thankfully breaking the monotonous silence. Shikamaru pumped chakra to his feet and stuck himself to the floor, the easiest way to come to an abrupt halt after jogging. He instinctively reached out to grab at Chuji's scarf, stopping him just in time. He would have missed it in their run, but Niji certainly hadn't, a tripwire. It was so thin that it was barely visible in the light, and as Shikamaru squinted he could see a few more ahead of them, expertly stretched out so that if you had missed one, you might have certainly ran into another if you hadn't been careful. More traps. Shikamaru sighed. Naturally it wasn't going to be an easy jog out. There's a large room up ahead. Hinata continued to look outward. It's got those seals again, that make it difficult to see. It looks like there's one person in the room, but it could just be another dummy. There's a large concentration of those seals on the ground, and a lot of tripwires. Niji added. But no movement. Most likely another dummy. Shikamaru concluded. But, in the case that it isn't, we need to tread carefully. If only Shino or Kiba had been here, he lamented, or even Gaara with that strange sand-eye ability that let him see in places he wasn't at. Usually the Byakugan's reconnaissance abilities were more than sufficient, but naturally Danzo would have expected that on his home turf. We need to just take it slow. Shikamaru continued. Niji, Hinata, you keep an eye on the tripwires. Chuji, you take point and start making your way through. I can use my shadows to catch you if you misstep. Alright. Chuji was naturally nervous, but Shikamaru figured if the largest of them couldn't make it through tripwire hell, they'd have to find an alternate method through anyway. If Chuji could make it, they could. It was a slow process. Whomever had set up these traps was a true expert, layering wires under wires and using the shadows to attempt to make it more difficult to see them. Shikamaru recognized the true trap beneath them all. This was just here to slow them down. The more cautious they were, the slower they were, which meant it would take longer for them to reach the end of this tunnel. But, that had certain implications. Shikamaru smiled. There's going to be an exit at the end of this. He told the others. That's why it's been trapped the way it has been. The other passages likely led to Danzo, but he figured some of us would have gotten trapped this way. All these wires means it takes longer for us to get help. That makes me believe that there isn't a dummy waiting for us. Niji added. He wouldn't have left our escape up to the chance of us potentially getting past these traps. Yep. Shikamaru sighed once again. Seems like that's the likely option. There was an enemy waiting for them. Potentially more, if the seals were skewing the Byakugan enough, but Hinata had seemed certain it was just one. If it was only one, it was likely a root agent that Danzo thought capable of taking on multiple people. Someone strong, at least Jounin level. And, most likely, the person who had set up all of these ridiculous tripwires. Troublesome. This person had the benefit of setting up their arena to their liking. A trap master in particular thrived off of controlling their surroundings. The only benefit Shikamaru could attribute to his group was that the enemy would have no way of knowing their own abilities, but even that was an iffy advantage at best. Sai had seen a dossier on clan abilities, so he had to assume everyone en route had seen it. And there were 4 clan children here, none of whom he knew had original, non-clan techniques. The enemy might not know them yet, but after a few moments of battle, it would become painfully obvious. That meant they only had one true advantage, and that was that they would be getting the first move. Shikamaru pulled out an empty scroll. It was possible they'd be close enough to the enemy now that they could be heard. His plan now depended on a measure of stealth, and it involved sending 3 of his fellows into an unknown, potentially deadly scenario, while he stayed behind. All with the fate of Root potentially on the line. But no pressure, of course. Shikamaru drew his companions in close and began to write. There's water ahead. Muddy water, really muddy water, and a person, though they've hidden their scent. They might be waiting in the water. Do you think it's an underground lake? Tenten asked. It might be a cave exit where the runoff has built up. Kakashi held up a hand and quieted the genin. While an exit was admittedly an exciting prospect after maneuvering through cave tunnels for what had to be close to half an hour now, Kiba had already scented an enemy, and it was foolish to think they'd be able to sneak on by without the enemy catching on. Plus, if it was only one, it was someone that Danzo had thought more than capable of preventing an escape. Jounin level at least, but most of Root were considered Umbu level to begin with. But Kakashi had an ace up his sleeve. Something that not even Danzo had known he had. If they planned things right, if he had time to build it up, Kamui could take out any opponent, no matter how skilled they were. Lee, you remember what Shikamaru told you back when we first entered here? He told me to be prepared to retreat and find assistance. Lee confirmed. But Kakashi-sensei, I want to dash. No, Lee. You're the fastest one here, and we're facing unknown enemies. Right now the most important thing is to assess the outside situation and bring help if the cage have gotten things under control. The 4 of us will be attempting to take our enemy down, but your primary goal is to get out, and that is an order. If something happens to us, you might be our only hope. I understand. Lee was, of course, sullen at being sent away from a fight, but the boy thankfully knew the value of seeking assistance. He bent down and pulled off his leg warmers, removing the weights he had hidden beneath. Good. He'd be far too fast for most shinobi to keep up with now. With everyone else running distraction, Lee would escape in no time. Good. Now, Shino, Tenten, the 2 of you will be staying back. If there's an underground lake coming up, it will likely be a large chamber, and you 2 are much better at range. Keep away from the main fight. Kiba, that means you and Akamaru will be providing me with backup. Got it. Kiba grinned, baring his sharp canines. We can knock down anyone that gets in Lee's way, no problem. That will be our first goal. Once Lee has gotten through, our secondary objective will be, if possible, a non-lethal takedown of whomever stands in our way. Root operatives can be rehabilitated with proper effort, and Lady Tsunade won't want to waste life if we can help it. If we're given no other option, then I'll do the takedown. He watched Tenten ready several weapon scrolls, saw Kiba pull out 2 ration pills for himself and Akamaru, and heard the soft buzz of Shino's insects preparing for battle. They were as ready as they'd ever be. With a hand signal, his team rushed forward. True to their predictions, the tunnel opened up into a large area that was nearly filled with water. There were a couple of high rocks and stones, but the dampness of the cave would likely make them too slippery to rely on. They'd have to rely on water walking, which was likely exactly what the enemy shinobi was hoping for. Kakashi did not see them above the water, and that meant they were dealing with a water-affinityed shinobi. A disadvantage already. Water slowly down thrown weapons, and Shino's bugs likely didn't hold up well in water either. He did, however, see a speck of light in the distance. An exit. He could almost feel Lee itching to try and run for it, but things were just too calm. Kakashi drew a shuriken and threw it towards the water, causing a small splash. For a moment, the water stilled. Then, Kakashi felt a rumble. The water suddenly burst upwards, and what appeared to be a giant catfish engulfed the area where the shuriken had hit. With a loud splash it landed back into the water, and Kakashi could see its large shadow going back to settle within its depths. I should have known Sharingan Kakashi would have come along to help the Konoha brats. A man rose up from the water, and Kakashi paled as he realized that it was Agano, the Kage of the river village. Someone at Kage level was potentially out of his league, out of all their leagues. The enemy leaders are under a different genjutsu of Danzo's. Sakura's words rang in his ears. Not only was this an enemy Kage, it was a potentially brainwashed Kage, which meant he couldn't, in good conscience, attempt a lethal takedown unless they had no other choice. Not that Kakashi minded taking down an enemy, but the thought crossed him that Sakura might kill him if he took down a compromised leader and put her treaty at risk. That meant, unless there wasn't any other option, no Kamui. Damn. Should have known the river shrew would have sided with the Konoha dissidents. Kakashi retorted in turn. If you think a big fish is enough to deter us, then you've let yourself get overconfident. He raised up a hand and began to summon lightning chakra to it. Water was a good conductor, and a lightning-natured technique would trump any earthen techniques the Kage could pull. There were rumors that Agano could use mud-style techniques with some proficiency as well, but even if those were true, Kakashi had the advantage. Then again, he was facing a Kage. If you think a little lightning scares me, you've gotten overconfident as well. Agano grinned. I know for a fact you cannot use your Chidori for long. Danzo estimated 3 or 4 times a day. All I have to do is dodge, and you've lost your advantage. The Chidori was an assassination technique, not meant for direct assault. Kakashi had the ability to react while using it due to the Sharingan, but even then, he needed to hold an opponent down to ensure the Chidori hit. His dogs would be ineffective at holding down Agano on water, which meant he needed to time his strike perfectly or else he'd waste a Chidori attempt. But first, they needed to get Lee out. Alright. Let's see you put your money where your mouth is. Kakashi offered, sinking into a ready stance. Lee, get ready to move. You can count on me, Kakashi-sensei. Lee nodded, readying himself as well. Without further ado, Kakashi pushed himself across the water. He caught a glimpse of the great fish beginning to move beneath him, and he leaped from the water's surface just as the fish lunged for him. For a moment, he prepared to strike below, and then Kiba slammed into it with a joint, fang over fang, technique, him and Akamaru each hitting the fish with powerful force. Kiba had promised to provide support, and Kakashi was glad the genin had already picked up on what he needed to do. In the distance, he saw Lee sprint across the water, too fast for anything but his Sharingan to even remotely pick up on. Lee had gotten through, now he could focus on the Kage. He let the momentum carry him downwards towards Agano, but instead of wasting a Chidori, Kakashi switched to a Kunao. Better to see how Agano moved first, and when Agano dispersed in a splash of water, Kakashi knew he'd made the right decision. Water clone. Agano likely wouldn't risk his true body until Kakashi had used up his chakra, which meant they had to find a way to flush him out. Kiba, keep the fish occupied. Kakashi called out. He kept quiet towards Tenten and Shino, for all he knew, Agano might not have caught wind of them yet, and if they could provide surprise ranged support, all the more advantage for him. Then, suddenly, he felt a hand grab around his ankle, and Kakashi's world became water. Sakura sensed Danzo before she sensed the other shinobi. The amount of chakra it was taking to power the Sharingan had become near blinding, and now there was a strange other chakra mixing in, one that reminded Sakura of the sturdiness of earth and the anxious flow of water. This strange chakra mingled with the chakra of the Sharingan and created something new, like how red and blue could make purple, only it was a new mixture of chakra and she had no idea what that entailed. Danzo had experimented on himself so much that he'd made new chakra. There was a small squad of root shinobi guarding the entrance to Danzo's lair, but even they couldn't stand up against the joint power of two Jinhiriki working together. Sakura didn't even feel the need to provide backup. While she trusted Gaara to hold back around her, she didn't want to risk getting between the fierce aura of the Kyuubi and Naruto's enemies. It was an aura that slowly peaked to match Danzo's strangeness, only instead of a strange mingle, the Kyuubi's aura was somehow raw, and Sakura could feel a weird bubbling of malice within it that genuinely scared her. Ino had been talking with the Kyuubi, though, so they could trust its influence, couldn't they? Shukaku had proven an ally, after all. Danzo's chamber was thankfully not trapped, and as the five of them pushed their way in, Sakura caught sight of another shinobi fleeing the scene, carrying with him several large scrolls. Danzo, however, did not flee. He stood, tall and proud, ready to face them, and he had replaced the used Sharingan in his arm with others that had not permanently shut. There was no way he thought Izanami would work on them again, so what was the point of those eyes now? Was there another technique he had yet to reveal? Sakura drew the kunao Kakashi had given her and took a ready stance. There was no need for words now, as far as she was concerned. Danzo had threatened the lives of her comrades. Danzo threatened the stability of Konoha. He had led to the destabilization of Omegakure, ordered the death of the Uchiha clan, had the audacity to claim it was for the good of Konoha. No, there was no holding back against a man like this. No chance for peace. No chance for diplomacy. You'd better be ready for an ass-kicking, Danzo. Naruto called out, somehow echoing Sakura's thoughts exactly. Sakura heard a bit of a growl in Naruto's voice, and even in the darkness of the cave she could see that his whisker markings had darkened, and his eyes had taken on a bestial appearance. The Kyuubi's influence was growing stronger, to the point where she could feel its presence even without her sensing jutsu. I believe I must admit to being proven wrong. Danzo answered. I had thought even Izanami would prove difficult to overcome, and yet here you stand before me, Sakura Haruno, no worse for the wear. You might even deserve the title of Sharingan Breaker. Sharingan Breaker? Had others called her that? Sakura had only heard the negative rumors in Konoha of how she had turned traitor, but she supposed, after surviving attack as Genjutsu, that word would have probably gotten out. But Sakura didn't let herself rise to Danzo's statement. She simply settled into her fighting stance, ready to move when her enemy did. No words for me? Danzo asked. I suppose you've heard enough from me. But I have yet to get everything I desire from you. Whether you hold some new Kekkei Genkai or you are just lucky, I shall find that out. Here and now, or later when I dissect your corpse. Gaara and Sai moved in front of her without another word, and Naruto, ever the battle-hungry one, called out for Danzo's attention instead. Hey you creepy bastard, I'm the one calling you out here. But Danzo seemed to ignore him, instead speaking to Sakura once more. I asked you if you were prepared for the trials ahead of you. It seems you were more prepared than I thought. But now, of course, we can see each other clearly. Much as Madara Uchiha and Hashirama Senju fought over their village's fate all those years ago, so now we too fight over that ancient question. Strength or unity? Your problem is that you think them mutually exclusive. Sakura finally let herself answer. Since you're stupid enough to try and fight us alone, we'll just have to show you what you're missing out on. Strangely, Danzo smiled at this. Show me, then. This time, Sakura, we end it. Sakura was ready, but true to form it was Naruto that moved first. She heard a pop as a clone came into existence, and both Naruto and clone put their hands together and began to generate chakra. It was a spiraling ball, the technique that Naruto had told her was called the Raise-Nan. However, it was different from the time she had seen it nearly a year ago, when Naruto had faced down Sasuke on the hospital roof. It shrieked for one thing, making a high-pitched noise that almost forced her to cover her ears. It reminded her of a howling wind, like the way windstorms would sometimes scream as they were pushed over the mountains in Iwagakure. A wind transformation of the original technique, it had to be. Naruto had mentioned that Jiraiya had been teaching him wind release, and with Tsunade teaching him chakra control, he'd applied both teachings to create a horrifying technique. Even more horrifying was when Naruto heaved the technique forward and it flew, spinning through the air like a shuriken and slamming directly into Danzo's body. The man hadn't even tried to dodge. Sakura noticed, why not? Why not try to move? Sakura saw blood fly as the technique cut through Danzo. No, it wasn't a cut, it was an evisceration, and it didn't stop there. It didn't stop until it hit the cave wall behind Danzo and cut into that too, spinning and spinning through the rock until Sakura had lost sight of it. Finally, the horrible screeching became too distant to hear, and a blessed silence fell over the chamber. Had that been it? Dumb bastard couldn't even handle my ultimate technique. Naruto said gleefully. See, Ino, what did I tell you? Naruto, what the hell was that? Ino demanded. You could have brought down the entire cave if you'd aimed that wrong. I got Danzo, didn't I? Naruto protested. And the cave is fine, it's fine. Tsunade made me practice aiming my Raisin Shuriken over and over for days, there's no way I can miss. Raisin, Shuriken? Not the most original name, but it had a certain ring to it. Sakura let herself smile. Maybe Danzo just hadn't planned on Naruto's ultimate technique being so strong. Maybe. Fortunately for me, it doesn't matter if you hit or miss. Sakura froze, her hair standing on end as she heard Danzo's voice from behind them. But she'd seen the technique hit, she had seen Danzo's body torn apart. How had he appeared behind them? Thanks to Izanagi, I am invincible. Sakura leaped backwards just in time, taking shelter behind Gaara's sand as Danzo sent forth a wind technique of his own. The sharp gust slammed against the sand but did not break. But Danzo had survived, and now Sakura had to figure out how. How could someone avoid a technique so powerful and not have a scratch on him? Substitution? A Sharingan technique. Izanami had been the first technique Danzo had used on them, Izanagi had to be a pair. But so far none of the eyes on Danzo's arm had closed. Either it wasn't a Sharingan technique, or it didn't force the eye closed like Izanami did. Either way, if she didn't figure it out quickly, they'd be fighting an invincible opponent. And that meant they were doomed to fail. Shikamaru had always maintained that fighting girls was troublesome. This was not due to him thinking them weak, or due to some misplaced sense of chivalry. His father had always encouraged him not to fight with girls, that was true, but that was because his father knew the truth that the world had yet to completely realize. Kunoichi had grown up in a world that had belittled them, delegated them to healing and support roles, and thought them the weaker of the sexes. Perhaps things were better now that the hidden villages allowed women to register as official shinobi, but prejudices from the warring era were still buried within the population, and Kunoichi were fighting against those prejudices from the moment they stepped into the academy. Because of this, Shikamaru knew, Kunoichi grew up fierce. So when Shikamaru peeked into the cavern and saw Kunoichi waiting for them, surrounded by dozens of tripwires and exploding tags, he knew he was in for a troublesome fight. Kunoichi were dangerous. A Kunoichi raised as a trap specialist en route was downright horrifying. If they didn't immobilize her quickly, Shikamaru knew they wouldn't be getting out of here alive. 3 little worms, crawling right into my nest. The Kunoichi announced. Lord Danzo told me I'd get to have some fun today. Will I get to see them dance? From his position, Shikamaru saw the 2 Hyuga fall into the gentle fist stance. Choji had yet to use his expansion jutsu, rather, he couldn't, not without risking setting off a wire. Still, his hands were at the ready. If the Kunoichi came close, he could enlarge his hands in an instant and land a powerful blow. 2 pretty Hyuga. The Kunoichi continued to speak, and Shikamaru saw her begin to walk across her wires like tightrope. Despite her weight, she wasn't setting the tripwires off. Was it some sort of unique technique? Or perhaps they weren't traps at all, but merely something for her to use to keep above her opponents? But Shikamaru knew that couldn't be trusted either. A true master would have mixed walking wires and trap ones, so that anyone else who tried to land on a wire would risk setting something off. 2 pretty Hyuga with 4 pretty eyes for my leader. If Lord Danzo has Byakugan and Sharingan, nobody will be able to challenge him. That implies you're capable of beating us. Niji countered. I have fought shinobi far more intimidating than you. Oh. The Kunoichi tilted her head, looking curious. Truly? Then I suppose I shall have to correct that. But first, let's bring your other little friend out to play. The Kunoichi brought her hands in front of her to make a hand sign, one Shikamaru did not recognize. After a moment, Shikamaru heard a hissing noise behind him. Somehow, she'd activated the tunnel traps from a distance. Shikamaru cursed, rushing forward and only just avoiding the traps in front of him as the tunnel suddenly exploded. He landed in a roll, coming to a skidding halt next to Chuji. Behind him, the tunnel began to collapse as large rocks landed and blocked the entrance. "Now you're all stuck in here with me," the Kunoichi announced. "Now I get to watch you dance." So much for Plan A. Shikamaru had planned to use his shadows to possess the Kunoichi from a safe distance, using the cave shadows to elongate his reach while the Hyuga distracted her. Now, however, the Kunoichi would see his hand sign and know the technique was coming, no matter how well she hid it. Plus, in the darkness of the cave, it was hard to get a glimpse of where the Kunoichi's natural shadow fell, and even more so when the Kunoichi moved. If Shikamaru couldn't catch her when she was still, he wouldn't be able to catch her at all. Right now, he just had to hope for a chance. Chuji fell into a defensive position next to him, letting his body grow so that Shikamaru was shielded from the Kunoichi's view. "Don't give up yet, Shika." "I know, buddy, I know." Shikamaru took a deep breath and readied his jutsu. "So long as she doesn't bring the damn cave down on us." It was a bad matchup no matter how he looked at it, and it became worse as the Kunoichi suddenly began to launch an assault of weaponry towards them. The Hyuga both leapt into action, deflecting the weapons with chakra-enhanced strikes, but they could only move so much without setting off one of the tripwires around them. Thankfully, their defense was still good enough to buy Shikamaru time. He began to weave his shadow along the tripwires, knowing at some point she would land on one of them. There were, by his count, at least 24 tripwires in the room, and with the enhancement of the shadows from the cave, he could reach out and cover at least half of them. It was a dangerous waiting game, but one that eventually paid off. The Kunoichi landed on one of his covered wires and came to a halt, grimacing as she realized what had happened. "Shadow possession complete," Shikamaru announced. "Could one of you go knock her out for me?" "Gladly." It was Niji who moved forward, expertly avoiding wires until he could get close enough for a blow. Shikamaru timed it, releasing his possession just as Niji aimed for the Kunoichi's heart. And then the Kunoichi burst into a puff of smoke. "A fucking clone. Naughty, naughty. That's not how you're supposed to dance." Not one, but 2 copies of the Kunoichi made their way onto the wires now, each cackling with glee as they began their shuriken assault once more. Hinata was now working double time to keep Chuji safe from projectiles, and Niji was prevented from rejoining the group with one clone focusing entirely on keeping him occupied. Niji managed to knock one out with an appropriately timed air palm technique, but as the one copy was eliminated, 2 more came to replace it. She's evenly split her chakra between them. "We can't tell which one is the original," Hinata called out. Then, Shikamaru decided, the original likely wasn't there to begin with. Why would a traps specialist risk getting caught in one of their own traps? Niji had mentioned a large concentration of blocking seals on the ground. He wondered if those seals were setups for traps, or if they were simply hiding the true Kunoichi from view. They needed to break the ground somehow, and while Chuji would normally be best for that, expansion only meant a chance that a tripwire would be set off. They could try to lengthen the battle and wait for the Kunoichi to drain herself of chakra from overuse of shadow clones, but every second wasted here was a second that some of their own had to spend potentially fighting Danzo alone. There was only one thing to do, and that was to try and figure out which tripwires were safe. Once Shikamaru had done that, he could maneuver Chuji to a safe area and attempt to break apart the ground beneath them, and hopefully not set off more traps in the process. From there, the Kunoichi would die. So Shikamaru watched. He knew the Hyuga were considering the situation too, and at one point Shikamaru saw Niji attempt to lash out at one of the wires that the Kunoichi had been walking on. A smart idea, take away her safe tripwires and she either risked setting off her traps or had to fight on the ground. However, even with chakra enhancing his strike, Niji's hand bled as it came into contact with the wire. The wire was sharp, that made sense. The Kunoichi was wearing boots, which protecting her skin from damage, but if anyone tried to cut the wire without a weapon, they were screwed. And of course, none of them here were really proficient at Kenjutsu. He had Kunao he could use, of course, but that required a decent guess to which wires were safe and leaving the comfort of Chuji's protection. It was a risk he was going to be forced to take. Right now, there were no other options, not unless there was some sort of miracle. Sakura always wished on that amulet of hers for luck, Shikamaru had noticed, though it had been subtle. She had gripped it and closed her eyes briefly before infiltrating the Uchiha compound, and even before going into battle with Lee. Whatever the amulet meant, she considered it lucky. It was silly, Shikamaru knew it was silly, but he let himself draw that symbol in the dirt beneath him. He needed Sakura's luck now. He readied a kunao and prepared to move, looking towards the closest wire that he knew the kunoichi had landed on moments before. Then, before he could move, the ceiling exploded above them. Several of the tripwires detonated as someone came through the rock, sending volleys of kunao in various directions. There was even a small explosion off in a corner nearby, but nowhere near any of his comrades. However, one of the kunoichi's clones poofed away in a burst of smoke as a new kunoichi with a shock of blue hair landed a powerful kick onto it. Shikamaru recognized the newcomer. It was the Taki shinobi, the one called Fu, only she was alive with a strangely powerful shroud of chakra, and chakric wings sprouting from her back. "You better leave Hinata alone, you piece of shit," Fu announced, drawing a twin pair of katana from her back. "Or else you're going to have to face me." Though he was vaguely annoyed that Fu hadn't really acknowledged the rest of the group's existence, he couldn't exactly begrudge the help. She'd detonated some of the tripwires without taking out any of their allies, and now they had someone with katanas who could help cut the damn things. Or, even better, she'd broken through the ceiling above them, and Shikamaru could now see the light of day shining through. That meant, whatever technique the kunoichi had used, she could break through rock. "Phew," he called out. "The real one is beneath us, you need to flush her out. Just don't set off any more tripwires." "Huh? Tripwires?" Fu looked around, frowning. "Oh, I guess there's a few of those, huh. But you don't have to worry about those since I'm here." She floated around the wires, whipping back and forth in a manner that reminded Shikamaru vaguely of a hummingbird. She grabbed hold of a protesting Niji and flew him back towards the group, depositing him on the ground next to Shikamaru. "All right, Hinata. Make sure you watch how strong I am, all right." Fu's frown turned into a grin. "First, I'll keep you safe from those traps." And then, with a deep breath, Fu was suddenly spewing threads around them, weaving them into a cocoon that covered them from every angle. It was a bit gross, Shikamaru had to admit, but Hinata seemed fascinated by them. "They're chakra-enhanced threads." "Damn right." He heard Fu call back from outside the cocoon. "They'll keep you safe, so stay in there, okay? I'll be done in just a minute." For a moment, there was silence. Then, Shikamaru heard and felt a series of large explosions come from outside the cocoon. He instinctively readied his kunao, not sure if that meant Fu had succeeded or lost. Surely no ordinary kunoichi could survive such a trapped room, could they? But it seemed as though a miracle had happened, for once the dust had settled it was Fu that returned to the cocoon, gently peeling it open to let the group out. "All done," she announced, reaching out to offer her hand to Hinata. "Shibuki told me it might be dangerous, but she wasn't so bad." "Man, are you for real?" Shikamaru groaned. "I thought we were toast." "Then you're lucky the strongest kunoichi in the world came to your rescue." "How did you even know where to find us?" Chuji asked. "I heard you." Fu rolled her eyes. "Duh. Anyone could feel the rumble of those explosions from outside. I figured you'd just gotten below ground somehow and I took a guess." "So she got lucky too." Shikamaru would have groaned more, but they were alive. They were alive, and now they could figure out what had happened to the others. "Phew, we need to find our companions. You know Sakura, right? She might need our help." "Sakura? But she's strong enough to handle anything," Fu argued. "Still, I owe her one for saving my butt in Taki. I guess I can go lend her a hand. But Hinata, you stay here and keep safe, all right?" But we should really go help too," Hinata replied, twiddling her fingers in a way Shikamaru hadn't seen her do unless Naruto was around. Was the girl nervous? Yeah, we all need to go. Shikamaru agreed. So, lead the way, if you can find them. All right, I can't say no to a pretty face. This time, as Fu took Hinata's hand, Shikamaru definitely saw the Hyuga blush. Kakashi was feeling an extreme sense of déjà vu today. First the second attempted takeover of Konoha during a Chunin exam, then the cave collapse, now drowning. Agano wasn't nearly as intimidating looking as Zabuza had been, but that didn't mean the cage couldn't spin together a nasty series of water jutsu all the same. If Kakashi tried a lightning technique underwater, he'd succeed in electrocuting Agano and himself, which wasn't the most desirable of outcomes. At the very least he wasn't trapped in a water bubble like Zabuza had managed, but it was almost worse to have the temporary taste of freedom, only to have Agano drag him back down again with a well-timed water whip. What didn't help was that Agano had allowed his catfish to kick up the mud in the water until visibility was practically zero. Kakashi didn't know which way was up even with his Sharingan activated, and it was only chance when he managed to get high enough to get a breath of fresh air. He needed to turn the situation around fast. He occasionally caught a glimpse of Kiba and Akamaru spiraling through the water, and the pair had done a decent enough job of keeping the giant catfish off his back. However, it also did a very decent job of stirring up the mud further, and sometimes Kakashi had to move just to get out of Kiba's assault. Thankfully, Guy's student had used the opportunity to plan. Agano was far too concerned with dealing with him to pay attention to a genin nearby, and Tenten took advantage. Whenever Kakashi broke the surface, he caught a glimpse of Tenten setting up a series of explosive tags alongside a wall, near to where the cave's entrance was. She was planning on trying to drain the lake, Kakashi realized, and Shino had moved to the entrance to try and direct her to a suitable location. It would take a pretty big explosion to make a hole to drain a lake this large, but Tenten had no shortage of tags. More importantly, an explosion that large would likely draw in attention, though whether that attention was friend or foe would depend on how the battle had gone outside. Kakashi, at this point, was willing to take a chance. His Sharingan was muddle, he couldn't summon his Ninken, and his Chidori would kill him just as quickly as it would kill his opponent. But even if Tenten was setting up for something big, he couldn't just sit here and take Agano's drowning like a water-washed genin. He'd sworn after Zabuza that he'd never allow himself to get trapped in such a situation ever again. Maybe he couldn't in good conscience use Kamui on a brainwashed cage, but he could use it on something else. The water. Kakashi's Sharingan spun to life, and he could feel it morphing at his will, pulling more energy before until his eye strained and began to bleed from the effort of it. In front of him, a vortex began to form. It drew the muddy water inwards like a maelstrom, and in the distance he saw Agano make a hasty retreat to avoid its influence. With every second more of the water drained, until Kakashi could eventually take a quick gasp of air. And then, with perfect timing, Tenten set off her bombs. Of course, without the layer of water around to protect him, Kakashi was sent flying with the impact of the explosion. But Agano was sent flying as well, and the resulting hole in the cave wall was enough to start a good portion of the lake draining. It was less water to deal with all around, less chance of drowning, and less for the enemy cage to use. Kakashi could only use Kamui once more, however, so he would have to make sure it counted. It gave the catfish an unexpected advantage, however. Without water to float in, the fish was now floundering about in such a way that it created small quakes that brought down rocks and stalactites around them. Kakashi pushed himself to his feet just in time to avoid getting crushed, and now it was a dance between himself, the enemy, and the terrain around them. Agano was a quick bastard, but with the water around him drained, the tables began to turn. Shino entered the battlefield, with a large swarm of Kikaicha spreading out from within his sleeves and making a beeline directly for the cage. Though Agano spit water bullets to defend himself, the swarm eventually reached him, and from there Kakashi knew it was only a matter of time. But Agano, it seemed, wasn't going to go down with a fight. Danzo predicted you might prove lucky. Agano announced with a sneer. And he told me, should it come down to this, that there was only one thing left that I could do. The man unfolded his jacket, and Kakashi could see even from a distance that his entire body had been covered in paper bombs. Agano was going to take himself out, and take the entire cave with him. What had Danzo done to the man? He had no choice. If he wanted to survive, If he wanted to keep these genin alive, he had to use Kamui before Agano could activate the bombs. He focused, letting his eye shift again and bleed. Dynamic entry. And then Guy was there, slamming a foot against Agano's face with all the power and grace of a taijutsu master, knocking the man unconscious. He couldn't activate the bombs in his sleep, which meant they could disarm him and manage him non-lethally. He wasn't sure how Guy had gotten there so quickly, but Kakashi could have kissed the man. He slumped to his knees, the exhaustion from near drowning and using Kamui finally catching up with his body. Sakura. He managed to tell Guy. We need to help Sakura. If Danzo had managed to brainwash a cage so efficiently, what else was he capable of? Gaara surrounded Danzo with his sand and crushed with enough force to craft diamonds. Sakura saw the blood ooze from the sandy tomb and saw limbs twitch in death. And then Danzo appeared behind them and struck again. She saw Sai land a killing blow, clean, straight through the heart. She saw the light fade from Danzo's eyes, felt his chakra fade. And then Danzo appeared behind them and struck again. It wasn't Izanami, Sakura knew he hadn't been misleading them with the name. It was Izanagi. No time loop. Just a strange sort of reset every time Danzo took a mortal blow. And it wasn't until Sakura noticed a small detail that she realized for sure that it had to be a Sharingan technique. One of the eyes on his arm had closed. It made sense. He had clearly gotten several transfusions to replace his lost ones before the battle had begun, so the eyes had to be doing something. She counted 23 eyes remaining on his arm, but they had landed far more killing blows than that. She retreated to a corner, counting on Gaara to cover her from Danzo's wind techniques. The man seemed to be toying with them, lazily shooting techniques whenever they came within range. She let Naruto and Sai trade blows with him for now, and instead Sakura focused on his arm. She saw another eye close. When that happened, she closed her eyes and sent out several pulsing sensory waves. That same chakra emanating from his arm was almost overwhelming. But all at once, specifically when Naruto drew near enough to land another fatal blow, the energy changed. Sakura began to count. 1, 2, 3. Danzo reappeared behind Naruto once more and slashed out with a short tanto. Naruto took the blow without even flinching. Of course, the Kyuubi's aura was more than enough to heal shallow wounds such as though. Sakura was somewhat envious. 15. 16. 17. Ino managed to land several poisoned senbon in Danzo's arm. She was aiming for the eyes, smart, but Danzo simply reappeared elsewhere again, all damage negated. But Sakura could still sense that strange energy. 32. 33. 34. Danzo had noticed she was hiding in a corner with her eyes closed. Naturally he'd be suspicious. Several wind jutsu were sent her way, but Gaara came to her side and effortlessly blocked them. 51. 52. 53. Danzo lunged for them, only to meet a rather grisly fate on the end of Gaara's sand. It morphed to form a claw on Gaara's arm, and she heard Danzo cough in pain as he was impaled upon it. 2 seconds later, he materialized elsewhere. 59. 60. The energy stopped. Sakura opened her eyes and noticed that one more of Danzo's eyes had closed. Ah. So that was it. She continued to count. 3 seconds later, the strange energy activated once more. That was their window. Gaara. Hold your action until I tell you. I need you to be ready to strike the instant I say so. Got it. Gaara nodded, his voice one with Shukaku's. You've found a weakness? I've found an opening. Good enough. They waited, and thankfully the others served a decent enough distraction. Danzo tried several times to get close to Sakura again, but Naruto would distract him with a roar and a flurry of shadow clones, or else Sai would send a flurry of inked birds his way. Sakura counted the seconds in her head once more, certain that this time it would work. Now. Gaara rushed forward, claw at the ready. Just as the energy faded, Gaara struck, and Danzo dodged. She saw Gaara's claws graze the side of his strange, white arm, and this time Danzo didn't reappear elsewhere. There was blood, and Danzo staggered as he moved away. Gaara went in for another blow, but at that point his technique had reactivated, and Danzo simply disappeared and reappeared once more. But the claw mark was still on his arm. The blow had hit. And Danzo, it seemed, had caught on to Sakura's revelation. He suddenly flew through a series of hand signs and put his hand to the ground, and all at once a large creature was summoned next to him. Sakura had never seen anything like it before. It had a long snout like an elephant, but it was stockier, and with thicker fur. More impressively was the effect it had on wind techniques. It sucked in the air directly in front of it, and then blew with the force of a hurricane. Danzo added his own wind to it, and it was only due to a sand wall created by Gaara that they weren't blown away towards the opposite wall. "He's figured out that I know," Sakura yelled over the roaring wind. "He's going to use that summon to make sure we can't attack during the opening." "You found an opening," Ino called out in turn. "Every Sharingan he has on that arm gives him a minute of invulnerability. He has a 3-second delay between eyes. That's still like half a fucking hour we can't touch him. That's why we have to time it just right. Which we can't do because of that summon's assault," Sai deduced. "He doesn't even have to activate that technique until he's certain he needs to, with that taper keeping us away. Then we need to get him to activate it. That's the only way to guarantee that we'll have a 3-second window. Then we need to get past the summon and then get someone to his arm before he has a chance to activate another one. We need that boy with the weird suit." Lee, was it? They had to strategize quickly now, and thankfully Sai was just as sharp on these matters as she was. "A way to get there quickly. You just what? Wish I'd figured out the hierarchy. But the seal is too vague, I'm not sure what makes up each part. The fox knows." It was Naruto who suddenly spoke up, and there was a slightly distant look in his eyes that Gaara sometimes got when he was listening in on Shukaku. The fox knows," Naruto repeated. "Hey, how the fuck does the fox know about the Hirae Watsit?" It hit Sakura all at once. Naruto didn't know yet, nobody had told him yet, and she made a note to rectify it if they survived Danzo, but his father was the one who had mastered the Hiraishin to begin with. And not only that, Naruto's mother, the original Jinchuriki, had been an immigrant from Ushiagakur, a village known for its sealing process. Had Kushina helped the fourth perfect the technique? If so, of course he would know, Sakura exclaimed. "I'll explain later, Naruto, but right now you need to work with Sai and figure out how to get that working as soon as possible. It'll only work if that summon is disabled," Sai pointed out. "The winds are too strong to throw a kunao." "I can do it." Ino raised a hand. "I can, if I get in its head, I can prevent it from using wind." "But that's a summon animal, Ino, not a person," Sakura protested. "Does your mind transfer technique even work on animals?" "It's not recommended," Ino admitted. "Animals are built differently from people, and it can have bad effects on the mind of the person who possesses one. But we don't have a choice, do we? If it's going to damage you, Ino, we have to find another choice." "No, Sakura. I promised I was in this until the end. I'm doing it." Ino looked as determined now as she ever could be, and Sakura was reminded of their match in the Chunin exams a year ago. Ino had been ready to take her on, ready to fight her as an equal, a different scenario, but the same determination to win. "We'll need to hold it down." "I can do that," Gaara offered. "Sand can hold onto its legs. But the instant I do that, we won't have cover anymore. Then I'll just have to hope my own earth wall is strong enough," Sakura concluded. "Naruto, will you be ready to land one of those Raisin Shuriken once Sai has his arm off?" "You know it." Naruto grinned. "Let's take this bastard down." Sai, did what the fox say make sense? "Sort of, the Uzushio method of sealing is very esoteric, but I can translate it into my own style if..." Sai took notes on an empty scroll before he held a hand out to Sakura. "That kunao of yours, can I borrow it? The prongs make it easier to stick into whatever I throw it at. I'll need to make sure it sticks where I throw it long enough to make the transfer." "Right." Sakura handed it over, and she briefly watched as Sai removed the paper seal around it and began to add his own. "It's slipshod, but it has a 50% chance of not tearing my body in half." 50%. Ino said it, didn't she? We're in this to the end. And if it's a chance to take Danzo down, I want that chance. Sai retorted. Sakura, please, let me have the chance. She was surrounded by ballsy idiots. But she was a ballsy idiot, so she couldn't really talk. Fine. 50% chance it is. I'm ready to put up defenses when you are, Gaara. Ino, make the mind transfer count. Sai, don't you dare miss. They were ready. This was what they'd been fighting for, this chance. They had to take it. Gaara's sand rushed forward, and at the same time Sakura pressed her hands to the earth and brought forth several walls in front of them, just in time to save Ino from a stray wind blast. Her walls shook with the force, and she knew she couldn't take it for much longer. Ino, go! Gaara cried out, and Ino leapt away from the safety of the wall and thrust her arms outward in the signature hand sign of her clan. Naruto caught her body just as she slumped to the floor, shielding her from the taper's wind. There was a moment where the wind continued to rush, and then everything stilled. Sakura ran to take Ino's body from Naruto, and Naruto began his assault. For now, Ino had control of the taper, and with Naruto rushing in to distract Danzo, that meant no more wind was headed their way. Sakura sent out pulse after pulse of sensing jutsu, counting down the seconds and hoping she could get the timing right. She whispered the seconds aloud for Sai to hear, and Sai prepared himself. He was a ranged fighter, hitting things from a distance was his strong suit, but Danzo dodging around Naruto was not going to make it easy. Plus, there was the 50% chance. Don't think about it, don't think about it. 55, 56, go. Sai threw the kunao. It sailed through the air and landed in Danzo's arm just as the strange chakra began to fade. Sai made a single hand sign, and Sakura saw a brilliant flash of yellow light engulf the cave. And then Sai appeared in front of Danzo and sliced with his katana, taking Danzo's arm off in one perfect motion. For the briefest of moments, Sakura felt elation. They'd done it. Danzo couldn't use that Demiz-Naga technique if he wasn't attached to his arm, and that meant Naruto could finally finish him off. Then she felt it. It was a rumble of energy, that strange half-earth, half-water energy that she'd initially felt before the fight had begun. She saw Danzo's remaining stump ripple as if it was actually water, and then wood shot out, dozens of wood branches that grew and spread outward until several of them impaled Sai through the chest and slammed him against the far cave wall. Sakura felt her scream freeze in her mouth. Her feet moved without her thinking, and she only vaguely processed Naruto rushing towards Danzo, the aura of the Kyuubi flaring up in righteous anger as he single-handedly pounded a Rasen Shuriken straight into Danzo's chest. She only vaguely processed Danzo's body exploding into tiny shredded pieces, and most certainly didn't process a final pulse of that strange Sharingan energy. She could only think of Sai, and as she came to a halt at his side the only thing she could process was that bodies didn't survive that. The tree branches faded to dust as Danzo did, and Sakura forced herself not to look at the wounds. She saw Sai cough, and knew there was blood, too much blood. No, no, Sai, no, don't you die, don't you die. If only Tsunade was here, if only someone that knew medical jutsu was here, but all she could do was pull bandages from her pouch and desperately try to curb the bleeding. Despite all of this, Sai had a smile on his face, a genuine smile that made her ache. Did you see that, Sakura? I flew. He was referring to the Hiraishin, and Sakura choked on a laugh as she realized Sai was talking about the technique with his goddamned dying breath. I'm finally free. No 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 no. He couldn't die, he couldn't die, he couldn't die. She felt the pulsing of his heartbeat, heard the pulsing of her own echoing in her mind, and all she could think of was how she'd give anything to keep him alive, anything, even her own life if that was what it took. Sai deserved so much more than he'd gotten, he deserved to live. And her amulet burned around her neck, burned so hot she was certain that it had to be on fire. And she saw her skin turn black and white, patterns echoing up her arms and across her face. And she felt pain, like there were holes burrowing into her chest, like she couldn't breathe, she couldn't move, and the pain was so intense that she couldn't help but yell, half in anguish, half in agony. All she could feel was pain, pain, pain. And the holes in Sai's chest began to close. And Haiden's voice echoed in her mind, how can you possibly hope to understand someone fully until you understand the pains they've been through? Sai's skin stitched together, and Sai took a confused but powerful breath as life flooded back into his body. And through this understanding you will find joy in the connection. And just as the final wound stitched shut, the pain in Sakura's body ebbed away, and she felt a blissful, overwhelming relief that Sai was alive, alive, alive. And everything faded to black. Danzo ran. His right eye bled, having been spent on a final use of his Nagi, and damn it all, it had been Shisui's eye that he'd needed to spend to stay alive, Shisui's damned eye that had allowed him to manipulate his pieces of the board to begin with. There was no replacing the Kota Amatsukami. No replacing this particular eye. But that damned girl had caught on to his Naga's trick, and that traitor of an agent had somehow mastered the Hiration, and everything was falling apart. His only consolation was that his medic had escaped with the final stock of eyes, and if he pulled a couple strings he could almost certainly get Orochimaru to make him a new arm, perhaps a better one. They wouldn't have known he survived, and he'd have time to plan, time to gather his forces again and make sure he hit them where it hurt. He followed the tunnel to its exit into the backwoods behind Konoha proper. There was a meeting point where he was supposed to meet his medic, just about a mile from the city. They could not return to Konoha now. With the cage free of his technique, there was no winning their civil war. They had to head east, regroup, bolster their numbers yet again. Danzo stopped as he caught sight of blood. He glimpsed unrolled scrolls on the ground, dropped by his medic, and further out a bloodied corpse. A blue-skinned man wielding a giant sword was standing passively. He didn't put up much of a fight. The man commented. Looks like you did, though. He might not be worth the effort, Itake. It is worth the effort. Danzo's head sank into his stomach as he heard a familiar voice. Why was Itake here? Last he'd heard, Itake was running errands for Akatsuki, not supposed to be anywhere near here. I heard everything, Danzo. Everything in that meeting. Everything laid bare. And I saw it all. Danzo caught sight of several crows gazing at him in the trees, and all of them seemed to reflect Itake's Sharingan within their eyes. You used me. You told me it was the only way. It was. Danzo protested. Even now they don't understand, we wouldn't have survived war with the Uchiha. But we would have survived war with you? Konoha would survive this. Itake seemed to fade into existence from the shadows, and the cold stare of his Sharingan paralyzed Danzo on the spot. You promised to keep Sasuke safe. You couldn't even keep that. He left of his own accord. You could have stopped him. You had the resources. You know how Orochimaru works. Everything you've said to me has been a lie. Everything you promised. Kisame is right. This world is filled with lies, isn't it? Danzo stepped backwards and tripped on a stray root, falling over with a grunt of pain. Itake, you must see reason. I see more clearly than ever, now. The burden you've given me. The burden you've passed on to my brother, onto this village. You're nothing but a stain. A blight upon Konoha. A plague. And do you know what you do with the source of a plague, Danzo? Danzo swallowed. There had to be somewhere he could run, somewhere he could go. You burn it. Danzo saw black flames, and began to scream. Chapter 62. At first Sakura heard voices, echoes around her, bits and pieces as she clung to the edge of consciousness tooth and nail. Everything hurt, a deep aching hurt that she'd never felt before in her life. Not even chakra drain had hurt this badly. But despite the hurt, the voices were somehow just as clear. You promise there's an exit this way. Danzo wouldn't have put himself somewhere he could not have escaped from. And how do we know for sure the bastard's dead? My seal is gone. Sakura felt warmth around her, warm arms gently holding her close. There was a rush of air around her, a gentle caress compared to the throbbing pain, but the pain was starting to fade to background noise now. Easy to ignore in favor of other things. She let herself drift away from her own thoughts, from the voices, focusing on that warmth. She could have sworn she heard a heartbeat somewhere, maybe her own? No, it was too steady to be a heartbeat. It was more a rhythmic thumping that she knew she'd heard somewhere before, but she couldn't quite put her finger on where. The thumping was important. The thumping was. She saw Konoha, a strange, distorted version of it that seemed to have a red film plastered over it haphazardly, and her lungs burned from having held air within them for so long, and she could walk on her own. Damn it all, she didn't know why Guy always insisted upon trying to carry her. What was more important now was finding Sakura, but the way that Agano had suddenly woken, as if released from a dream, had made him wonder if maybe she'd gotten Danzo after all. But she was Sakura, wasn't she? And there was thumping, thumping, thumping. The world turned even darker red and blurred to the point of difficulty, but even so Sakura could see black flames licking at a small pile of ash and she felt equal parts vindictive and lost. What did it mean now? What had any of it meant? He'd promised, he'd promised, he'd promised. And the world thumped behind her ears. She saw light at the end of a tunnel, and she looked over to see, Brainless, Naruto carrying, Blondie, Ino piggyback, and she knew Sakura would be happy that the two were unscathed. But she was Sakura. And she looked behind to see Gaara carrying. How could she be there when she was here? And the thumping stopped. And Sakura woke with a desperate gasp, clawing at Gaara's shoulder as she was thrust back into consciousness, and at first she was overcome with such a violent vertigo that she almost heaved onto her friend. The group stopped as she came to, and Gaara hastily set her onto the ground. Sakura, it's okay, we're safe. I was. Sai was. Sakura tried to pull together thoughts, looking back and forth between her comrades as she tried to figure out how she'd somehow been running with them moments ago, only to be with Gaara now. She remembered fighting Danzo, she remembered burning Danzo, she remembered Sai being dead, but he was here. Sakura forced herself to take a breath, the initial panic working its way out of her body and replacing itself with an almost agonizing relief. As Sai knelt down to check on her, she let herself throw her arms around him. You were dead. She whispered. You were. Sai said something in turn, probably something cheeky, but Sakura just pulled him in tightly and for a moment refused to let go. The aftermath of the battle was something of a blur. She felt shaky as she walked, and every now and then her mind would flash back to the pain and the thumping, and even though she didn't want to worry her companions, she occasionally had to stop and just let the experience pass over her. Kakashi had fretted over her upon finding her in a way that was surprisingly endearing, despite the fact that he looked about as dead on his feet as she did. It was from him that she eventually learned some of the more important details. The civilians had been successfully evacuated prior to the skirmish, thanks to his friend Tenzo, and though there were shinobi casualties, the quick mobilization of the cage had prevented too much bloodshed. Not a perfect end to a civil war, but not a bad one either. Still, that there were any casualties at all. Sakura hadn't really believed they could take down Danzo peacefully, but perhaps as an ambassador she'd hoped. Managing the aftermath was the job of the cage, so after Sakura had confirmed that the skirmish was well and truly over, she joined her companions in making their way to the Nara compound, where each of the Konoha rookies, plus one very exhausted-looking team guy and one very chipper-looking few, had gathered under similar mindset. They'd done it. Somehow, despite everything, they'd won. Can't believe the motherfucker tried to bring a cave down on us. Kiba was growling to anyone who'd listen. All his talk of, the best of Konoha this and, for the good of the village that, and he was really ready to just kill a bunch of clan heirs for daring to call him out. Wait, so, who was Danzo again? Few asked, the most confused of the bunch. I'd just thought everyone had gone crazy all of a sudden. The elders always said the other villages would fight over nothing. So what, you just up and decided to join in? Hinata was in danger. The banter only grew louder as Naruto and Ino joined in, each of them more than willing to complain about Danzo's bullshit arm, which reminded Sakura of a very important question: where had Danzo's arm gone? Had it been destroyed along with the rest of his body? No, Sai informed her as they sat. Naruto actually had the foresight to grab the thing while we were fussing over you. He might not be as brainless as I thought. He reached into his back pouch and pulled out a small sealing scroll, handing it to Sakura. To be honest, I'm not quite sure what to do with it. The eyes deserve some sort of burial, but, Sakura looked forlornly in the distance, towards the Uchiha compound. I don't really know Uchiha customs. And someone could just dig them up again if we're not careful. Well, eyes tend to rot fairly quickly, though I suppose they hadn't rotted away in that arm. That arm. Sakura frowned. It's got a weird chakra. And when it just turned into a tree like that, I couldn't believe it. What do you think it's made of? I might know, but I won't say it here. My root seal might be gone, but the village might still kill me. Sai shrugged. Considering we've survived to continue our journey as ambassadors, I should probably try not to make Konoha hate me. So, you're staying with us? Of course. Why wouldn't I? Sai blinked. Don't tell me you've become brainless. And no, I just, Sakura flushed, looking away. Well, now that Root's going to be disbanded, I could probably convince Tsunade to take you back, and you wouldn't have to worry about Danzo trying to take your life. You don't have to come with. You have become brainless. Sakura flinched as Sai suddenly reached out to gently rap at her forehead with his knuckles, much in the same way Sakura would often get him and Naruto when they argued. Don't be stupid, fisticuffs. We're a team. And maybe Sakura had known it before, but hearing it for sure now, really knowing that it was true, it brought a warmth to her that finally put her mind at ease. She smiled, reaching out to take Sai's hand, and then reaching to take Gaara's with her other. For a moment, for even just a little while, with her childhood friends around her and her team at her side, Sakura was home. I won't lie to you, princess. This is a damned mess. Oniki was ever the blunt one, and Sakura couldn't help but smile fondly as her mentor paced back and forth in the meeting room. There was a straightforwardness to Earth Country folk that she'd missed. I know it's a damned mess, it's my fucking village. Tsunade grumbled. In front of her, the Kusakage and Tanikage were tied up and sealed with chakra restraints, as well as several of the Suna nobles. Temari was unbound, but only because she had turned at the last minute and refused to fight against Konoha. There were several bound members of Root as well, the upper management, now that Danzo had been taken care of. No one said pulling Roots was easy. Shivuki offered kindly. If it didn't happen now, it would have destroyed you from the inside or gotten far uglier to deal with in the future. We've been through 2 minor wars in 2 years, one of which was a civil war. If not for the actions of children, Konoha might have been lost to Danzo. And now we face Kumo and Kiri, who are going to hear of this and dash. And what? Oniki challenged. Face 4 united villages in combat. I'm amazed you'd want to stay in this treatise after all of this. Tsunade blinked in shock. Of course I will, I helped draft the damned thing. And considering what Danzo managed to pull on these 2 idiots, Oniki gave Agano a small kick, and Sakura had to suppress a snort. I dare say nobody smart is going to hold what he's done against you. For all we know he turned his Sharingan on you at some point. The problem, Oniki-senpai, is that most people will not accept that excuse. Sakura offered. I've seen a bit of it already. Clan heads are searching through Root agents and finding lost members. Shinobi are wondering if their children really died in combat or were just recruited. The majority of the Konoha is questioning, well, not just Tsunade, but all the previous Kage for allowing Danzo to move about unchecked. The third, the fourth, Danzo has existed under all their reigns. I've heard some of the civilians claiming that the current system isn't good enough. Tsunade groaned. They're questioning the goddamned system that's been in place since my grandfather, and they're right. Hiruzen's sentimental mistakes nearly cost us the village. Danzo cost us an entire clan. And now all the Kage will be forced to question their own subordinates and what goes on beneath their notice. The Plains leader, Satomi, spoke solemnly. While Shinobi will now question whether their own leaders are in their right minds. We don't know the extent of Danzo's jutsu and we don't know how under those effects these people still are. Well, that's just proof of why we need the ambassadors, isn't it? Sai offered. After all, it was due to Sakura's determination that we were able to address this situation. And Shikamaru's planning. Sakura pointed out. It was a joint effort. I can't possibly hope to understand the nuances of every village like I understand this one. I'm going to need people on the inside to assist me if I come across a situation like this again. Shikamaru was able to pull together all that evidence because he was here and had help. Ambassadors are not always going to be in the village, so she froze, letting her thoughts run. That was it, that was the key right there. So they need help. She clapped her hands together, and at the same time she saw sparks of understanding in the cage's eyes. You're talking about an investigative task force, local to the village, to aid the ambassadors with understanding local situations and how best to handle them. Tsunade offered. A group who serve both their cage and the ambassadors in keeping the peace. Shinobi who are loyal to the village but willing to look into the village's faults and improve them. You said before that your biggest concern was that the ambassadors wouldn't be in every village all the time to maintain the tenets of the treaty. Onaki pointed out. A hand-picked group that can help do that for you, however, and not have to leave the village proper. It would have to be people I could trust to keep an eye on the village. Sakura added. I might have to come up with some sort of testing system, or maybe in-person interviews. They could give us monthly reports, let us know if a village directly needs ambassador influence. Someone that any village member could go to with concerns. And if the concerns are legitimate, that could lead to an ambassador summoned to handle the problem. And, Tsunade got a wicked grin. I know just who would work for my village. Sakura blanched when she realized just how violently Shikamaru was going to kill her for this. It was only a start, and the idea would need ironing out. But having villagers be able to report to her directly. It could be civilians too. Sakura thought aloud. Doesn't have to just be shinobi. In fact, civilians might even be more trustworthy, since they're not necessarily directly tied military activity. But civilians don't know the first thing about shinobi life. They can't break out of genjutsu or keep watch on a shinobi moving at 5 times their speed. A bold assumption. Surprisingly, it was Shivuki that spoke up. Taki civilians are more than capable of keeping tabs on shinobi. The civilian education program includes basic self-defense. Doesn't yours? The other cage quieted down at that, and while Sakura was more than ready to get into discussing the merits of civilian influence on shinobi politics, there technically was a more pressing matter at hand. Before we get too deep into this, Sakura looked towards the captives in the center of the room. We have war prisoners. Correct. Onaki smirked. Some West Side rats need to be dealt with. And Konoha has some dissidents to discipline. You'll leave Root to me? Tsunade insisted. But as for Suna, Kusa, and Tani, I might have been under Danzo's influence before, but I won't make a stupid choice now. Takeshi, the Tani cage, suddenly joined in the conversation. Resisting your demands now would mean my life and the disruption of my village. We took enough risks today. He looked to Sakura, determined. I know it will be difficult to trust us, but I ask you allow Tani to sign onto your treaty now. All I want is to take my shinobi home and tend to our wounded. Coward. Agano spat from his seat next to him. Danzo may have been a manipulative bastard, but he had a point. This treaty won't last. Iwa and Konoha look friendly now, but one of them looks at the other funny and suddenly Grass and River are in the middle of another shinobi world war again. You're going to be the only damned village that hasn't signed on this side of the country at this rate. Takeshi countered. If anything, you should be doing it for the economic benefit. The other villages won't trade with River now if you aren't signed on. My village is self-sustainable. So you'll refuse, then, Lord Agano? Sakura confirmed, raising an eyebrow. If so, your fate will be left at the hands of the allied leaders, who will vote on how best to deal with you. I will not stop them if they vote for your execution. Bah. Agano frowned. I hadn't said I wouldn't sign the damn thing. Just that it wouldn't last. I'll take my life and the illusion of peace while it lasts. Sakura nodded, then turned to Temari. And Suna? Suna was supposed to be an ally of Konoha. Temari replied. That we have been manipulated twice against you, it is as much my shame as it is on the elders of my village. Some of that shame may be thrust towards Danzo. I will carry the burden nonetheless. I ordered the death of my brother. She looked towards Gaara, the picture of shame and guilt. My brother whom was driven from our village due to our treatment of him, of which I played a part. That Suna has survived to have a chance to learn from our mistakes is a blessing. I will sign your treaty and I will discipline my people myself. And, Temari looked more determined now. Suna assist Konoha in fixing the damages caused by our invasion. Our shinobi will remain here at your service, Lady Tsunade. Reparations. It was a decent offer, and Sakura saw a bit of relief pass over Gaara's face. If not for Tamari's change of heart, Suna might have fared far worse. Whatever Shikamaru had done to convince her, it had been for the better. "You're a bit young for a cage," Onaki commented with a chuckle. "You need to learn to grow a bit of backbone. If you'd been this bold before Danzo would have brainwashed her with his Sharingan and we'd be even worse off," Sakura pointed out. "I cannot hold any of these villages accountable now knowing what he was capable of. Danzo is dead. Konoha stands. And we now have 3 new villages agreeing to the Neutrality Pact. I would suggest keeping these villages under strict surveillance until they leave Konoha's borders, but otherwise my verdict is that they have suffered enough under Danzo's hands. I will not pursue further action unless the other villages insist upon it." There were no objections, and with that Sakura allowed herself a breath of relief. She'd been dreading the meeting, but it appeared as though the captured cage had begun to see some sort of reason, even if Agano was still every bit the shit he was while Danzo had been controlling him. That just left one village for her to convince that was still within Konoha's borders. A certain Amekage hadn't shown up to this meeting, and Sakura felt a nervous pit in her stomach as she considered why. Konan had stayed to help protect the city. Where was she now? As the cage meeting wound down, Sakura excused herself to attempt to answer those questions, Gaara and Sai leaving with her. They meandered across the rooftops, keeping an eye out for a shock of blue hair or the twinkle of an AIM headband. They found the AIM shinobi at the gates, and they were not alone. Sakura paused as she caught sight of Jiraiya speaking with Konan, in a somewhat familiar manner. "Big old Amekage now, Konan? I wouldn't have guessed it of you. I could say you taught me well." "Yeah, maybe not well enough." Jiraiya rubbed the back of his neck, uncomfortable. "I heard what happened to the AIM rebels, you know. I'd wanted to go see if any of you had survived, but Hanzo would not have allowed you across our borders very easily." "No, he wouldn't have." Jiraiya hesitated before offering Konan a smile. "But I can't say AIM's new leader doesn't bring a smile to my face. You've grown into a hell of a woman, Konan." Sakura held back, not wanting to intrude on a moment between master and student, but it was Konan who looked towards her and beckoned her over. "I knew you'd seek me out," Konan told her. "You want to know why I didn't meet with the rest of the cage?" "Yeah." Sakura nodded. "And I still haven't heard about AIM's stance on my treaty." Konan closed her eyes, and her smile was somewhat melancholy. "I cannot sign it, Sakura Harino." "You can't?" Sakura allowed herself an outburst. "But I would have thought You have given me a chance to enact revenge on one who has wronged me," Konan continued. "But you know little of my country. Little of the people there, little of how things work. You have been to Iwa, to Suna, to Konoha, to Taki, and you no doubt elbowed Tani and Kusa-in, but they have no choice. They cannot afford to say no after losing their invasion so thoroughly. AIM, on the other hand, has no such obligation. AIM has been a middle ground for war for decades. We have been trampled upon by other villages. Beaten down. Why would we ally with those who have thought us beneath them for so long? Protection." Sakura struggled to think of an answer. "I can ensure they won't again. Look me in the eyes, Sakura, and tell me that you think my caution is unwarranted." Sakura couldn't. AIM's caution was logical. "Will you at least think on it?" Sakura asked. "Maybe if I gave you time to see what the villages are like under the treaty? If AIM sees that long-term peace can be a reality, that would be a good argument for my cause, wouldn't it?" "Yes, it would." Konan agreed with a nod. "I cannot guarantee that my people will accept this. But I can guarantee that I will speak highly of you. Perhaps with time, you will show them. If not, then AIM has lost nothing." It was better than a hard no. Sakura had allowed herself to hope, but realistically, Konan was right. She didn't know much about AIM, other than a brief interaction with their cage and 3 of their genin. Konan seemed reasonable enough that Sakura hoped they wouldn't be actively antagonistic towards her allied countries, so being allowed time to convince them wasn't likely to end badly. And if she used that time wisely, got other countries like Kumo and Kiri to sign on, eventually AIM would have to join them. She held out a hand to Konan. I understand. I appreciate that you were willing to hear me out nonetheless, and I would like to thank each of you for your assistance here in Konoha. She made sure to shoot a grateful smile to the 3 genin nearby. Your team here are most certainly Chiryunin material, if my recommendation means anything. To her surprise, Konan chuckled. Perhaps it will, she replied. She reached out towards Sakura, but instead of taking her hand in a handshake, she put one hand beneath Sakura's to hold it steady, and held the other just above it. A long piece of paper floated from Konan's sleeve and folded itself into a small paper crane. Keep this, she told Sakura. Consider it an angel's blessing. Sakura held the crane gently in her hand, thanking Konan as the AIM shinobi turned to leave. Jiraiya came to stand next to her, and they both watched until the shinobi were long out of view. Did she tell you much? Jiraiya finally asked. About her companions. The ones she lost in the rebellion. No, Sakura shook her head. And I didn't want to pry, I suppose. I see. Jiraiya was quiet a moment longer before reaching out to gently ruffle her hair. Sakura let out a bit of an undignified squeak at the gesture. Don't worry about it, then. You've done a lot of good for Konoha, kid. You should be taking a break. Leave the world to the adults for a bit. Because the adults were doing so good. Sakura stuck out her tongue. There's too much to do, still. I already promised Tsunade I'd help direct some of the damage control, and there's still the matter of discussing Akatsuki with everyone. I mean it, Sakura. Take a break, or I'll have Naruto make you. Don't get burned out. Besides, don't you want to check on your parents? I already did, thank you very much. And speaking of... Sakura put her hands on her hips, trying her best to look intimidating. It was hard when addressing Jiraiya, he had at least a foot on her, and that was before taking his tall sandals into account. When are you going to tell Naruto about his parents? She saw Jiraiya blanch at this, and to his credit, he looked guilty at the mention. It was the third who insisted on secrecy. Jiraiya explained. I'd always thought it was silly, but Hiruzen thought if word got out that Naruto was Minato's kid. I'm amazed it hasn't already. He's the spitting image. Sakura protested. Plus, it can't have been much of a secret that the fourth was smitten with Kushina Uzumaki. If the third was so intent on keeping secrets, shouldn't he have changed Naruto's surname? Yeah, you make a good point. Jiraiya sighed. I'd actually planned on telling him, at the end of our training journey, but then he had to run back here and start training under Tsunade too. I decided then that I'd wait and see if he made Chiryunin and then tell him. But, maybe I've just been putting it off. Please don't let your nostalgia get in the way. Sakura pleaded. He needs to know. If you tell him, I'll take a break. Making deals now. Jiraiya smirked, ruffling her hair again. I guess you're suited to be an ambassador after all. All right. I'll tell him first chance we get alone. Sakura would make sure he kept that promise, but for now, Jiraiya was right. She was tired, more tired than she cared to admit after all the work that had gone into taking Danzo down. And even with Root taken care of, she now had more questions than she'd started with. How had she healed Sai? Who was the masked man who had attacked them in the Uchiha compound? Most importantly, what now? For the first time in weeks, Sakura settled into her bedroom and didn't worry about the lives of any of her comrades. She'd already allowed her parents to dote on her for an evening, both sides equally grateful that the other was unharmed. She and her father had worked together to try and recreate an IWA stew recipe that Sakura had remembered, and while certain IWA herbs weren't available in Konoha, she was able to find substitutes that made do. The evening was a relaxing affair, even though her father insisted she regale them with everything that had been going on behind their backs since Sakura had arrived home, and once they had all gotten full bellies from stew, Sakura let herself be dragged upstairs by the boys. It was then that it truly sunk in that Danzo was dead. Each of them simultaneously slumped down onto the floor, and Sakura couldn't help but laugh at the scene. Do you think the cage do this too? She asked aloud. After a long battle for their country ends, they come home and throw themselves on the floor. My father would shut himself in his room after a long day. Gaara answered. But I find it hard to picture him throwing himself to the floor. He wasn't really emotional. Tsunade though. Sakura giggled. Tsunade would. She'd get a bottle of sake and flop, I guarantee it. And Oniki too, maybe before his back got so bad. Maybe we should make it a tradition. The celebratory flop. And then Sakura had an idea. She scrambled to her feet, running to her closet and pulling out spare blankets and pillows. It was something she hadn't done since she and Ino were younger, and maybe they were technically a bit old for it now, but Gaara and Sai hadn't gotten real childhoods, and celebrating the end of Danzo was more than worth letting themselves act a little childish. "Help me set up," she told the others. "What are we setting up?" Gaara asked, though he dutifully took a blanket and began to spread it out. "Sleepover time." Sakura grinned. "We all pile on the floor and play silly games and tell scary stories until we fall asleep." "Don't we already sleep in here anyway?" Sai countered. "And Gaara doesn't sleep." "Right." Sakura paused, then turned to look towards Gaara. "But, your seal is different now. You and Shukaku are kind of like friends now, right? Don't you think he could let you sleep, even just for one night? If we can trust him while you were in Izanami." I think I trust him." Gaara agreed. "But I don't know how to fall asleep. Not without a jutsu. If we need to use the jutsu, we will, and I'll wake you up tomorrow," Sakura promised. "But for now, this is a night to have fun." She was the only one with pajamas, which was something she'd have to rectify later, but eventually the pillows and blankets were set up, the lights were dimmed, and Sakura began to educate the boys on proper sleepover activities. Most of the things she and Ino used to do were probably a bit much for Gaara and Sai. They used to spend hours just talking about what sort of kunoichi they would be, what boys were cute and which ones were annoying, or which was better, kunao, shuriken, or senbon. They would do each other's hair and paint each other's nails, and if they were particularly daring they'd play rounds of truth or dare, and that was where Sakura decided to begin. She made sure that the truths were silly questions at first and the dares even sillier. Sai admitted with some prying that his favorite color was purple, and learned, after daring Gaara to down a spoonful from the bottle of hot sauce that Sakura's parents had downstairs, that Suna food was usually spicy, something Sakura neglected to mention until Gaara had taken the spoonful with a perfectly straight face. Gaara admitted that his most embarrassing moment had been during his time in IWA, inside the small cave where Rashi and Han had often taken him to meditate. He'd slipped on the damp cave floor, more used to dry sandstone than wet rock, and had fallen into a cave pool. Rashi hadn't been able to stop laughing for over an hour, and after Han had helped him out, even he had let out a small chuckle. And the true highlight of the night was during a dare of Sakura's. Sai had dared her to try and drink a glass of water while doing a handstand, and in the middle of it, Emi jumped into the room and startled her enough for her to dump the entire glass onto her face. All three of them devolved into laughter after that, and between laughs Sakura teasingly scolded the Tanuki, who had been missing since the Konoha civil war had started. Now she decides to show up. Sakura picked Emi up and cuddled her close. "Where were you when Danzo was trying to kill us, We could have used your sharp little teeth." It was Gaara who finally realized that Emi was carrying something around her neck. It was a small little scroll on a string, and the symbol on it, a golden leaf, was not one that any of them recognized. Emi allowed Gaara to take it from her, and as Gaara unraveled it, it was revealed as a storage scroll, and within the storage scroll was a large, intricate box. A puzzle box, as it turned out, and one that Gaara fiddled with and mulled over for a while as the night progressed. The only clue they got as to why or how Emi had gotten the box came from Shukaku, who claimed that it was a test for Gaara, and refused to say more. Sakura and Sai each tried to assist, but every time they did, Emi would come and bite at their ankles, first gently, and then not so gently until the two of them got the hint. Whatever this was, it was for Gaara alone, and seeing as Shukaku didn't see any harm in it, Sakura didn't let herself worry. Eventually, exhaustion caught up with Sakura and Sai both, and they each laid down in the pillow nest. There was a tense moment as Gaara put himself to sleep with a single hand sign, but instead of a fearsome rush of Baijuyo chakra, Gaara simply slept. Both Sakura and Sai watched over him for a long while, not only making sure that Shukaku would keep dormant, but also marveling over the sight of it. He told me he's only ever slept in battle before. Sakura told Sai in a whisper. I guess Shukaku's really warmed up to him. Or maybe it was your new seal. Maybe. Sai agreed. And now Emi brought him that box. There's a registry of summon animals in the root archives. There's only one record of Tanuki summons, and it was more legend than actual record. They say the first Tsunajin hierarchy could summon them. Summons. Sakura grinned. Oh, wouldn't that just be so cool? I've always dreamed about finding a summon contract, but I know they're usually kept within clans. But I think Gaara deserves it, don't you think? I deserve it more. I'm the one who made the seal better. Sai teased back. But I suppose I don't have a giant Tanuki with me. And you can just draw any summon you want. Sakura retorted. And now you have Hiration. Not really. Sai shook his head. He reached over to grab one of his scrolls, unrolling it for Sakura to see. What the Kyuubi told me was rudimentary, meant to do what I needed. He called it a simple version, meant for short-distance transportation. With these current seals, I still need to be able to see and visualize an area in order for the jutsu to connect. The fourth could appear somewhere he'd never been before, miles away, and he could do it without risking tearing his body in half in the process. There's a stabilizing factor that the Kyuubi couldn't remember quite right, and it might be linked to one's personal chakra signature. And that sounds like homework for later. Sakura reached over to gently move the scroll away. We've been up late enough, no need to stay up all night. Oh, I'd thought it was equivalent exchange. Gaara gets to sleep, we all stay up the night instead. Sakura grabbed a small pillow and thwacked Sai on the arm. Oh, go to bed, you snarky bastard. Fine. But one more question. Shoot. How did you heal me? That, Sakura wished she knew. She remembered pain. She remembered the thumping. Remember some sort of power flowing through her. Remembered seeing Sai's wounds just stitched together like they had never existed at all. I don't know. She admitted. She glanced towards her amulet, left carefully on a desk nearby. I have theories, but they're not necessarily good ones. I think it's tied to that amulet. To that weird religion that Akatsuki guy followed, that I met in Plains. Jashinism. I remember you mentioning it before. Sai nodded. But I don't have any knowledge of it. Not even Root had anything, at least as far as I knew. I just have one lead. Yogakur. Supposedly that's where other worshippers are, and maybe they'll know. It looked familiar to me. It took me a while to put it together. Sai, despite Sakura's protests, pulled out a sketchbook. Look, this is you. How I remember you. Both when you saved me, and during the Chunin exams. These marks here reminded me of something, and it finally hit me the other day exactly what. Have you seen the monument to the first Hokage? The small shrine at the northeast end of Konoha. I went there once when I was in the academy. Sakura admitted. That's supposedly where he was buried, though everyone I know secretly agrees that the real burial site is somewhere hidden. Right. But that's not all that's there. Do you remember the paintings and tapestries on the walls? Yes. They depict the various events that the first became known for. There's a large one depicting the Warring States era, one depicting the founding of Konoha. Do you remember the one that showed his battle with Madara Uchiha? It took some thinking, but eventually Sakura could piece it together in her head. She could see Madara, expertly depicted as riding on the head of the Kyuubi, Sharingan blazing, gunbei and scythe in hand. And Hashirama Senju, bringing forests to life behind him, and his face was covered in. He had markings. Sakura remembered. Markings around his eyes and down his face. And 2 circles on his forehead. She gasped, looking down at Sai's depiction of her. Just like my markings. They call it Sage Mode. Sai explained. Only a few shinobi have ever harnessed it. It is taught by animal sages, and it is very secretive how it works. What is known is that somehow, the user harnesses the chakra of nature to enhance their body and chakric abilities, and that causes those markings to appear on their body. Are you saying I'm somehow activating Sage Mode? Sakura asked in disbelief. But how would I possibly do that on accident? You said it's taught by animal sages, and I've never been taught, obviously. I know. But you can't deny that there's a similarity. Maybe that amulet helps you channel nature energy more easily. Or maybe that particular symbol is a seal of sorts. Sai shrugged. Either way, we need to find out. You being able to heal my injuries so easily is more than a little useful. Yeah, but at what cost? Sakura shivered. It hurt, Sai. It was like the worst pain I'd ever felt in my life. It felt like I was the one dying. I blacked out. How useful is that? We're both still here. We're both alive to talk about it. Maybe. Sakura agreed. But I think speculating isn't going to get us anywhere. Yogakure is on my list. We'll go there and find answers, and if I can use it without putting myself out in the process, you know I will. All right. Sai nodded, looking satisfied as he put his sketchbook away. So long as we have a plan. Well, our current plan is to rest. No more plans for the next week or so. Help me, I'll tie you to a bed and leave you there. Sai put up his hands in surrender, and before long the two of them were lost in sleep as well. In the week that followed, the invading shinobi from Tani and Kusa were roped into helping with village repairs, and Tamari kept her promise to provide Suna assistance as well. There had been some unavoidable collateral damage, as tended to happen when shinobi of cage level fought, but by the end of the week most of the buildings had been repaired and Konoha was functioning near to what it had been before the fighting had begun. Though there was much to discuss with the cage about the future, Sakura let herself focus on repairing Konoha during that week, knowing that with several major villages and multiple cage within its walls, even Akatsuki wouldn't dare try to attack. But the clock was still ticking, and despite her insistence to Gaara and Sai that they use this time to rest and recuperate, she couldn't even stop herself from mulling over where they went from here. There were two major villages she needed to persuade to join her treaty, as well as several minor ones, one of which included Otagakure, Orochimaru's home turf. She needed to figure out whatever it was that Yogakure knew about her new and strange abilities. She had to make sure that the villages were primed to defend themselves from Akatsuki. And she needed to do so all while keeping her own Jinhuriki friend safe. Not to mention the plethora of other issues, such as what to do about Sasuke, what to do about the other strange and menacing Uchiha from the compound, what to do after all these goals were managed. She'd known, in the back of her mind, how demanding a job as an ambassador would be. But she hadn't really felt the weight of it until she realized that solving one problem had just led to a dozen more. Was this what her life was to be like forever? Could she be certain that she could still handle it? Sakura could only be grateful that she wasn't facing things alone. Her boys were more than welcome to quietly discuss ideas with her every time they retired for the evening, and by the time Konoha had settled down, Sakura was already planning another meeting with several of the cage to discuss plans. Tsunade, somehow, managed to beat her to the punch. Sakura was called to the Hokage's office for a meeting to discuss Konoha's future, and when she arrived she was surprised to find all of the Konoha rookies there, as well as Team Guy. Good. That's the last of you. Tsunade spoke up, looking out from her desk to address them. So this makes everyone who was involved in the, what did you call it, Naruto? Operation Konoha Revival. Naruto said with a grin. And I want to stress that we weren't involved with this, Tenten spoke up with a grimace. We helped in the fight, sure, but that's the extent of it. Maybe so, but Kakashi has informed me that you provided valuable backup, and your instructor has also given me the highest recommendations of your skills and abilities. Everyone here who is under my jurisdiction and at genin level, I have brought you here to commend you for your work in uncovering Danzo's activities, and for helping to bring him to justice. On top of that, I can say that each of your teams performed admirably in the Chiryunin exams. With that, Tsunade unrolled a scroll on her desk, and with a puff of smoke revealed 9 Chiryunin vests. I think the village might riot if I didn't allow your promotions. She continued. Each of you have served your village above and beyond Chiryunin level. Congratulations. Naruto was the first to respond, letting out a whoop of excitement as he rushed to grab his vest. It didn't take long for the others to move as well, and the room became a bustling of laughter and cheers as everyone pulled on their vests. It was touching to watch, though it made Sakura wonder why her team had been pulled in to watch. Had Tsunade just wanted her to be present for her friend's success? Settle down, everyone, settle down. Tsunade called out. I'm not done yet, so hold your celebrating for later. We have a couple other business matters to attend to. Shikamaru, get up here, you're next. Next? Shikamaru questioned, but as he made to step forward his eyes suddenly widened. No. No, 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 you are not. The village council voted on it, Shikamaru. You're the one who kept this group in line. Sakura more than recommended your abilities, and it is well known that you organized the evidence to use in Danzo's trial. By rather popular demand, you have been promoted to Jounin rank. No, this is such a drag, I'll never be able to get any peace now. Shikamaru moaned. Oh, come on, Shika, this is great. Ino insisted, throwing an arm around his shoulder. That means you'll be able to lead the team on missions now, just like Asuma wanted. Asuma wanted this. Shikamaru looked equal parts confused and distraught over the news of his promotion, and if Sakura was honest, she felt a little bad for the boy. She knew promotions could be turned down, so if he was really against it, she knew it wouldn't stick. But Shikamaru really only seemed to be protesting the new responsibilities that the rank entailed, and not necessarily the promotion itself. She'd have to tell him that she knew plenty of lazy Jounin. She couldn't remember a time that Kakashi hadn't been late to any of Team 7's activities, and yet he was one of the strongest shinobi she knew. But her thoughts were distracted as Tsunade spoke up again, this time pulling out another scroll as she did so. This last piece of business was actually a joint effort, agreed upon by the Cage, for Sakura, Gaara, and Sai. We agreed that it might be helpful to your cause if there was an easy way to identify ambassadors, and we also agreed it might serve you well if this identification was similar to our own methods of identification. There was another puff of smoke, and the scroll revealed 3 objects, headbands. But engraved on the metal was not a symbol of any village Sakura knew. Instead, a single circle was engraved, matching the circle that Sakura wore on her back. She felt her breath hitch in her throat as she realized. Oniki made them himself. Tsunade explained. He and Shibuki both agreed that your little circle would be a good starting symbol. Something about simplicity and unity. Sakura reached out to take the one in the middle, that had been made with a deep red leather to match her attire. Oniki knew her well, and had guessed well for the boys. The remaining 2 had leathers of dark brown and black respectively. She reached up to tie her headband around her head, on top of Ino's ribbon, which she was reluctant to let go of just yet. Gaara let his hand on one of the straps holding his sand scroll to his back, and Sai placed his at the more traditional spot over his forehead. Sakura grinned. They're perfect, Tsunade. Thank you. Good. Now you 3 stick around. The rest of you, go celebrate your promotions. I'm requesting a bonus stipend be allocated to all of you for your troubles, so consider your dinner on me tonight. There was more cheering, the biggest coming from Chuji this time, and Sakura wished she could join them. But Tsunade grew more serious as the others left, and she knew this was a conversation she couldn't avoid. Sakura, I am under the impression that you will be dealing with 2 things in the immediate future that concern me. Probably more than that, if I'm honest. I'm referring to your future dealings with Otogakure. Your future dealings with Orochimaru and Sasuke Uchiha. Oh. Sakura sat herself down, knowing this conversation might last a while. Tsunade folded her arms and leaned back in her chair. You told me before that you retrieved Danzo's arm. That is correct. Will Konoha be demanding that we surrender it? Most of Konoha is. Tsunade answered. But I spoke against it. That arm and its assets belong to the Uchiha, and unfortunately both of our Uchiha are technically village traitors. However, of those 2, one helped perpetuate the Uchiha massacre, and the other is a victim of it. Thus, I've concluded that the arm should now belong to Sasuke. Sakura let out a hiss of air at this. Do you really think Sasuke is going to want a reminder of what Konoha let happen to his clan? I've already wondered how badly he's going to react to the news that Danzo planned it. No, I don't think he wants it. Tsunade agreed. But maybe that's for the better. There are many people who want this arm, Sakura. I trust an Uchiha survivor to use the bloody inheritance of his clan more so than I trust anyone else. You'd be bringing the arm directly within range of Orochimaru. Sai countered. Who would be more than happy for the donation? I wasn't saying to give it to him now. In fact, unless you think the situation is changing, I would advise you to wait. Wait until Orochimaru has either succeeded or failed in taking over his body. Wait until Sasuke is in a position where he is strong enough to defend it. If that means you hold on to the scroll for the next 2 years, so be it. What I am saying is that I am trusting you to do what is right with it, and my belief is that the arm should return to the Uchiha clan. It was better than haphazardly burying it, and it was better than leaving it in the hands of someone who could potentially be the next Danzo. Sakura couldn't find an argument against it. Regardless of what Sasuke's current state of mind was, he was the Uchiha clan now. And Tsunade was right. The eyes belonged to him. I'll do as you ask. When the time is right, Sasuke will receive it. I'm glad we agree. Now, on to the more pressing matter. Orochimaru. Tsunade leaned forward, meeting Sakura's eyes. Are you seriously planning on trying to persuade him to sign the treaty? I have to, don't I? Sakura replied. To show bias here would be damning against my cause. Orochimaru leads a hidden village. He's a cage. I have no choice but to try and persuade him. You're being stupidly honorable, but I get it. But are you sure you're prepared to speak with Orochimaru on his level? No. Sakura admitted. Quite frankly, he terrifies me. When I last saw him, it was the last Chunin exams, and he was hurting my team. He invaded Konoha. He killed the third and tried to kill you. That he did. Tsunade nodded. He's a scary son of a bitch. Denying that is foolish. Going in to try and persuade him to do anything is even more foolish. He won't just listen to pretty words. He's going to want something. He's going to demand you give something in return, and it may not be something you want to give. The arm, maybe. If not something worse. But I grew up with him. I know how he thinks. I know most of his repertoire of techniques. And I want to guarantee, if things go wrong, that you're ready to face him. Tsunade suddenly grinned. So, for the next week, I am going to drill you on Orochimaru, and I am going to make sure you are thoroughly capable of kicking his ass if he tries anything funny. I know I can't keep you for long, but I can make sure that you and yours are ready. It's the least I can do for what you've done for Konoha. Does that sound good to you? Sakura couldn't help but grin in return. It was an avenue she hadn't considered. Tsunade, and even Jiraiya as well, they had been his teammates. Who better to go for on advice for handling the Snake Chunin than them? When do we start? Chapter 63. Sakura was given 1 day to listen to Tsunade and Jiraiya talk about Orochimaru and take notes. She was given a rundown of everything the Chunin could remember: abilities, jutsu, physical prowess, weapon proficiency, summoning animals, even tidbits on Kabuto from their spar with him almost a year ago. But not just fighting prowess, no, they went into his personality as well. How Orochimaru thought, how he approached a situation, what strategies he tended to employ, even something as simple as what food he preferred, which Sakura had never cared to think about but now she knew. And it was admittedly a bit hilarious that the shinobi known for being able to swallow any object he got his hands on preferred foods he could take in large bites. Sashimi, in particular, was one they remembered him indulging in often. Sakura wondered if Orochimaru had atrocious table manners, and hated how much the thought humanized him. After the 1 day, Tsunade told her to memorize everything they had gone over, which was fairly easy for Sakura. She expected some sort of test for Tsunade to confirm that she'd taken in everything she'd learned. She didn't expect Tsunade coming at her with the full force of a raging bull, demanding that she both dodge her technique and recite information about Orochimaru that Jiraiya shouted from the sidelines. What's the name of his largest snake summon? Sakura cursed out loud as one of Tsunade's punches broke a tree next to her, wood splinters cutting into her skin as she desperately tried to avoid the next blow. I'm pretty sure his name wasn't fuck the last time I checked. Amanda. Sakura forced herself to call out, ducking low as Tsunade swung a kick towards her face. She wasn't supposed to attack back, only dodge, but it was still difficult just to do that. And Sakura got the feeling that Tsunade was holding back. Jiraiya was getting a major kick out of this, of course, but Naruto was as well. Tsunade had apparently trained him similarly before the Chunin exams, and Naruto told her that being able to see someone else dodging Tsunade's massive blows was vindicating. Gaara looked almost constipated as he tried to hold his sand back from rushing around Sakura. No point in dodge practice if Gaara was just protecting her the entire time. And Sai, of course, was sketching the whole affair, and every time Tsunade landed a hit, Sai recreated the whole affair to tease Sakura with later. Sakura swore she was going to learn Tsunade's technique one day and see how he liked it. What's his dominant hand? Neither. Sakura wheezed. He uses both equally to prevent weakness. And then she slipped, and Tsunade's fist was headed straight for her face, but instead of feeling a bone-breaking punch, Tsunade shifted at the last moment and flicked her on the forehead. The force was still enough to knock Sakura backwards and onto the ground, but nothing was broken. Maybe some bruises, definitely some bruises on Sakura's ego. Maybe she'd trained under Oniki in Iwa Taijutsu, but Oniki had always been defensive, encouraging Sakura to learn the confidence to attack and push forward in a fight. Learning to be defensive was another feat entirely, especially when she couldn't block any of Tsunade's attacks without risking her arm getting broken. She was nowhere near Kage level of skill yet. And Naruto had been doing this daily before the Chunin exams had begun. Of course, Naruto had Kyuubi enhanced stamina and had been dodging angry shinobi since he could do pranks. So maybe the comparison wasn't the greatest. You're done for the day, Tsunade told her. We'll work on improving your passive reaction time. You won't be able to think strategy in a fight if you are also thinking about dodging. That's what Gaara's for, Sakura retorted, her voice a bit squeaky as she tried to catch her breath. And when Gaara is otherwise occupied? What if you're separated? Sakura just groaned in response. Tsunade was right, of course, and there really wasn't any downside to training her reaction time. But that didn't mean it didn't suck. She barely remembered the walk home, and only just remembered the sight of a couch before she threw herself face first into it and let the blessing of sleep overtake her. She woke to Sai gently pushing at her shoulder, her body still sore from training and her eyes stubbornly refusing to open. Sleep was good, sleep was life, that was, until Sai informed her that Naruto was waiting at the door and was asking for her and her alone. Naruto didn't look himself. He was quiet, which was really the first sign that something was wrong, and he was uncharacteristically nervous as he asked her to join him for dinner. Sakura was expecting Ichiraku, but was surprised when Naruto took a different turn and led her to his apartment instead. It had been cleaned up since the last time she'd seen it. Sakura noticed several houseplants sitting at his windowsill, looking well watered and groomed. Instead of empty boxes of ramen scattered about in his kitchen, she saw a clean stack of dishes and what looked to be a rack full of spices, most of which held the Akimichi label. There was new furniture. Instead of a dingy dinner table and mismatched chairs, Naruto had acquired a matching dining set, and sitting in the middle of the table was a cut of fresh flowers that were no doubt from the Yamanaka shop. Naruto hadn't taken kunoichi classes, so Sakura was fairly certain he'd missed the double meaning of the flowers Ino had chosen to grace him with. White camellias front and center, Ino had never been particularly subtle. It looked pleasantly homey, and Sakura couldn't help but smile. Team 10, they'd given Naruto what she and Sasuke hadn't. A sense of camaraderie, even at home. And manners, by the look of things, as Naruto immediately went to put together a kettle of tea. Sakura let herself sit at the table and waited. Naruto would talk when he was ready. Jiraiya finally told me everything. She'd figured that was the root of the matter. Jiraiya had promised her, after all, and she'd sworn to herself if Jiraiya hadn't told Naruto who his parents were, she would. So, how do you feel? I dunno. It's been kind of weird. Naruto chuckled nervously, rubbing the back of his neck. I mean, I think I kind of felt everything when he told me. The fourth being my father, I mean he's been my hero for as long as I can remember. It should be awesome that I'm his son, shouldn't it? But, Naruto looked back towards the tea, his solemn attitude from before returning. In a way I'm kind of upset. He put the Kyuubi into me, and I get he had to do something to stop him from rampaging, but, why me? My mother was the previous host, and she was put through so much for it. Why put me through that too? All the hateful eyes, all the words spat at my face when I was old enough to understand them. He wasn't stupid. He probably knew. Sakura answered quietly. He was probably thinking, he could put the Kyuubi into a random child and they would suffer and maybe they couldn't handle it. Maybe they'd end up like Gaara was. Alone, scared, weak, but maybe he thought his child would be strong enough to handle it, like Kushina was. Maybe. Naruto nodded. But I think I'm still, Jiraiya said it was okay to be confused. They kept it from me for so long and I think I'm upset with everyone else, too. They said it was to keep me safe. I think I would have rather been in danger and known. I can understand that. Sakura didn't really know how she'd react if she was in Naruto's shoes. She'd always known her parents, always known that she would have a loving family to come home to. To feel scorn every day from everyone around you, to feel unwanted and unloved because of a burden you didn't choose to carry, Sakura didn't know how anyone could inflict that fate on any child, let alone their own. But she wasn't the fourth, and she hadn't been there. Maybe things had been desperate. Maybe things had been inevitable. Naruto sat a hot cup of tea in front of her before sitting across from her at the table. I don't mean to be a mope. He began. I think everyone's used to me being optimistic. I'm used to me being optimistic. It's easy to just believe that if you keep moving forward, everything will turn out alright. It's easy to try and think the best of people regardless of what they've done. I don't hate the old man for keeping things from me. I don't hate Tsunade or Pervy Sage. They were doing what they thought was right, even if I don't agree with them. And I think, in a weird way, it helped me realize something. Oh. I don't hate Sasuke either. Sakura's smile turned soft. Well, of course you don't, Naruto. I think everyone else did, though. Naruto admitted. Because of Sasuke leaving, Neji and Chuji got hurt real bad. They could have died. I could have died, too, if things had gone just a little bit differently. I hadn't really thought about it until I started working with Team 10. They were wary of me, at first, like they thought just cause I was around that things might go bad again. And it wasn't because of the fox. It was because they were thinking about what Sasuke did, in leaving. The village talks about him too, you know. Sasuke used to be the last Uchiha. Naruto did a dramatic wave of his hand at the title. And now he's just the traitor. His actions had consequences. Sakura agreed. For the village, they didn't see Sasuke. They saw the loss of an asset. They saw someone abandoning their home for a murderer. Just like they saw me as a weapon. Yeah. But I don't hate him for leaving. I didn't before now. He was my friend. Nobody else saw him like that. Maybe if they'd seen him, he wouldn't have left. Maybe if the village stopped seeing shinobi as tools, we wouldn't be like this. Danzo wouldn't have been like this. Maybe Haku wouldn't have died. Haku. Now that was a name that brought her back. Sakura hadn't thought of the land of waves in some time. You made a promise then, didn't you? That you'd change things. Yeah. And I will. Naruto looked her in the eyes, and Sakura saw the spark again. The spark of when Naruto promised something and meant it. But there was something more to it now, a maturity that hadn't been there before. I didn't get it. Sasuke was right. I should have, but I didn't see it then. I can't just be a Hokage anymore, Sakura, I have to be a Hokage that makes things right. I have to be a Hokage that makes it so the village doesn't see shinobi as tools or weapons. I have to be different than all the other Hokage before me, not just better. I gotta be like you. Sakura blinked at this. Like her? You mean, like the Neutrality Pact? Exactly. When you left the village, you did so because you wanted to make things better. And you didn't care who tried to stop you or what the village would think of you, you just went. And maybe the village thought you were a traitor before now, but then you came back and you and Shika just took on everything. Sakura laughed nervously. Well, it's not so glamorous as that, Naruto. I was scared out of my wits when I left, and I'd always intended to come back before Oniki got to me. It wasn't really noble, Naruto, if anything it was selfish. I didn't want to be left behind anymore. If anything I'm just like Sasuke. I just happened to leave in a way that ended up benefiting the village, and even then, Sakura thought of the battle reparations, of everything Tsunade now had to shoulder with the absence of Root. It's been rough, Naruto. I mean, hasn't it always been? Sakura's laugh was more genuine this time. Yes, I guess so. Besides, it doesn't matter because you're doing the right thing now. And I'm gonna too. One day, I want to be a Hokage that can be proud to sign your pact. I want to be the Hokage of a village that takes pride in their people and looks after them. I want to be Hokage of a village where nobody ever wants to leave. Then Naruto finally grinned, and it was like a fog had been lifted over the room. Yeah, that's exactly what I want. He continued. And I guess I just wanted you to know that, Sakura. And I was hoping, if you meet Sasuke again, that you could tell him that for me, and maybe tell him that it's okay if he doesn't want to come home, but that doesn't mean I'm not going to try to make the village something he'd want to come home to anyway. Somewhere that doesn't have people who talk about killing clans just because they want their eyes, you know. I do. Sakura smiled in turn. I really do, Naruto. And I think you're going to be the best Hokage there's ever been. You know I will. Naruto insisted. And don't you forget it. You tell all the other Kage that they better step things up, otherwise I'm going to leave them all in the dust one day with how great I make the village. It was refreshing to see Naruto cheery again, and there was something that had been eating away at Sakura that had cleared with his confession. Deep down, under the weight of Danzo and Akatsuki and uniting the shinobi countries, she'd always carried an even heavier weight, the weight of a promise to bring Sasuke home. But Naruto was right. After all this, after what Danzo had done, she couldn't hold it against Sasuke for leaving the village that treated his clan like disposable tools. Maybe she still needed to speak with him, but she no longer had the pressure of convincing him. Ino was right. Naruto just had a way of making everything seem like it would be okay again. They chatted well into the night, talking about everything they had missed while they were apart and everything that was to come. Sakura promised Naruto that they'd get a chance to spar the next time she returned to Konoha, and in return Naruto promised her that he'd write every month she was away. Sakura considered it, staying in touch with the future 6th Hokage. It was, in a weird sort of way, their goodbye. But unlike the last time they had parted, it wasn't bittersweet. By the time a week had passed, Sakura was exhausted and absolutely positive she could spout facts about Orochimaru in her sleep. When she wasn't spouting facts, her dreams were filled with anxious visages of Tsunade's fists coming at her with terrible speed. It might not have been the most orthodox method of training, but in a way Sakura was grateful for it. Even a week's time under Tsunade's guidance had helped her see weaknesses in her own fighting style, and forced her to learn methods of dodging to combat those weaknesses. Her mind adjusted quickly enough, and by the final day Sakura wasn't just reciting facts about Orochimaru, but facts about the rest of Akatsuki as well in rapid-fire succession. Around her, things had calmed down considerably. With the village reparations finished, Sakura was allowed to call one final meeting of the Kage, getting official signatures from Tani and Kusa on her pact and conveying everything she knew about Akatsuki and the threat they posed. There were several suggestions thrown about, including a quarantine of the Jinhuriki in a protected area, but that idea was shut down quickly by Taki, who relied on Fu to help mitigate the flow of demons into their country. The villages compromised on a less extreme option, a collaborative information-gathering effort that would attempt to locate and track each member of Akatsuki as well as ascertain their skill sets. Sakura would be a part of the effort by virtue of her traveling and gathering information anyway, and they would use Konoha's hawks to coordinate who was tracking which and to share anything new that was discovered. An expedition into the mountain's graveyard, though proposed, was turned down for the moment. Konoha was too fresh from the battle with Danzo, and considering expeditions there had gone poorly in the past, no one was quite ready to try again. Maybe in the future, if all the villages were allied under Sakura's pact, but not before, which meant the mystery of the demons would remain a mystery a little longer. Sakura passively packed and planned. Sai was able to craft massive sealing scrolls, which meant she could afford to take more with her from home. Her parents would always welcome them, that much was abundantly clear, but Sakura had to face the truth, Konoha couldn't be her home anymore. One day she would find a place to settle down, where the shinobi ambassadors could live separate from any village's influence, but for now they were wanderers. She packed every article of clothing she'd ever owned, she packed her entire bookshelf of basic shinobi texts she'd studied at the academy, and she packed all the non-perishable food she could afford to splurge on. Her team was decent enough at survival at this point, but she refused to take her chances. There was a question of money and what the ambassadors would do to obtain it, and for now it was decided that they would simply take up odd jobs when they could and hope that other countries would be charitable hosts otherwise. Shinobi mercenaries made just as much of a living as village shinobi, and until their group of ambassadors was big enough to integrate into the world economy, they'd simply take things day by day as most others did. Eventually, they reached a point where they couldn't draw out the inevitable any longer. Sakura announced to everyone she knew that the next day, they would be leaving Konoha to continue their journey. It was only natural that Kakashi sought her out before then. She hadn't seen much of him since the village reparations had begun, and Sakura had an inkling that part of it had to do with Kakashi getting roped into the rehabilitation of Root, alongside that other strange man, Tenzo. Both had been a part of Root at some point, and thus were able to provide a personal touch in helping bring many of the agents back into Konoha proper. The few times Sakura had seen him, she had seen a couple of younger agents following him like ducklings, much to the older shinobi's chagrin. There were no ducklings when he came to her, however. Sakura had retired to her parents' home for the evening and had gone to the rooftops to stargaze with Gaara when Kakashi had appeared in a quiet puff of smoke. Gaara scooted to another corner of the roof to allow the two a moment to talk. "Yo." Kakashi began. "Yo." Sakura answered. "You're leaving tomorrow?" "Yup. I can't come with you this time." "I know." Sakura let out a small sigh at the thought. It had been somewhat comforting to have Kakashi with them, but she'd always known at some point they'd have to part ways. Kakashi was, through and through, a loyal Konoha shinobi. She suddenly felt a weight on her head as Kakashi rested a hand on it. "Here I am, watching my cute student leave the nest for good. I don't know if my heart can take it." "You know I'll be back," Sakura insisted with a pout. "It's not like it's going to be the last time you'll see me." And then they were both quiet, because there was something unspoken in the words there. They didn't know. With Akatsuki hunting Jinchuriki, with Orochimaru, and even with the uncertainty of how Sakura would be received in other villages, there was no guarantee that Sakura would be alive a month from now, even a week. "You could write to me," Sakura suggested suddenly. "If you're so worried about your cute student." "Ma, do I seem like the letter-writing type?" "No, but I was kind of hoping I could squeeze at least one out of you." Everyone else promised. "Ah, emotional manipulation. Kunoichi tactics for beginners." Kakashi chuckled. "I suppose I could send a word or two on occasion." Sakura grinned at that. But it was hard to keep the cheer. She'd needed to talk to Kakashi for a while now, and this was a subject that she hadn't really been quite sure how to breach. Sakura decided to take a leaf out of Sai's book and dive in without any transition. "There's another Uchiha in Akatsuki." She saw Kakashi freeze up at that mention. "I've told Tsunade a bit of what I know," Sakura continued with a sigh. "As well as the other Kage, but I've tried to keep mention of it quiet because I'm not quite sure what to think. When Shikamaru and I were investigating the Uchiha compound." "I'll pretend I didn't hear that." Tsunade pretended to. Sakura stuck out her tongue. "But while we were there, we were approached by a man in a mask. He had a Sharingan. And at one point, when I got the mask off him, I got to see, he only had one Sharingan." She could almost see the confusion and fear in Kakashi's eyes. He knew why she was bringing it up with him. He knew what she was implying. "Only one. His right eye." Sakura pointed. "And that side of his face it was distorted, like his skin was strange somehow, like it had been crushed and then molded back to J-." Kakashi suddenly stood, and for a moment Sakura was convinced he was going to leave. Kakashi looked as though he wanted to run away. She'd never seen her sensei distraught before, but there was no other word for what he was showing now. "You're absolutely certain?" "Shikamaru can verify." "It shouldn't be possible, but why?" "I don't know," Sakura admitted. "He referred to me as Kakashi's student, sensei, like it was important to him that I was named as that. Kakashi began to pace, and Sakura had to stop herself from saying more right away. It was a massive bomb to drop on someone, the knowledge that an old teammate might be alive and might be with the enemy. He claimed he wanted a world of peace. He tried to recruit me. He said he wanted to end war and stop suffering. Whatever it is Akatsuki's doing, he thinks it's right. She decided to leave out the part where he'd tried to kill her and Shikamaru. Sakura got the feeling Kakashi didn't need to hear the bad details right now. He might not necessarily be an enemy. If he comes for Naruto he will be. If he hurts you, he will be. Sensei dash. I haven't seen Obito Uchiha in over a decade. Kakashi interrupted. I don't see how it could be possible. But if it is, and if he comes for my students, I won't let my grief hold me back. I know. Sakura nodded. You've always said you'd keep us safe, Sensei, and I know you mean it. But if there's a chance it could be him, I just wanted you to be prepared. Thank you, Sakura. They were quiet for a while. Sakura wasn't sure what else to say that wouldn't hurt him further. She'd never known Obito Uchiha of course, but it was clear what the man had meant to Kakashi. An Uchiha didn't just give a Sharingan to anyone. There was a bond there, a bond that might need to be broken. Kakashi left the rooftop eventually. Sakura knew she'd see him again before they left. After learning something like that, anyone would need space. Even she felt cold and depressed after such a conversation with her sensei. However, she certainly didn't complain when Gaara came to sit close to her again, putting a gentle hand over hers. At some point the boy had begun to learn how to comfort her, and Sakura couldn't help but smile as she noticed him picking up subtle gestures that she had begun with him when they had first traveled together. Whatever the masked Uchiha had been, regardless of what came after, she had her team. Even if Kakashi wasn't there, Sakura would never be alone. Sakura stood at the gates of Konoha and several dozen others stood with her. Her parents, her fellow graduates, her sensei, even Tsunade and Jiraiya had come to see her off. She reiterated promises to her friends that she would write, that she would visit again, that she would do her damnedest to keep herself and her boys alive. She exchanged hugs and fond farewells. She even coerced a hug out of the still somewhat broody Kakashi, whispering him a promise all the while that she'd find the truth. Naruto followed them out the gates, pulling out one more promise from Sakura. Find a way to keep Sasuke safe. She wasn't sure she could keep it, but Sakura gave Naruto a thumbs up anyway. It's the promise of a lifetime. Naruto had laughed, and as Sakura made her way down the road away from her old home, he waited at the gates the longest, waving at them until they were too far away to see. So, where next? The road Sakura had steered them upon headed northeast. The main path would take them to the far north, towards Kumigakure. Sakura unfolded her map in front of her, tracing routes as they walked. Kumigakure was on the list, of course, as was Otagakure. But there was one place that Sakura wanted to visit before either of those. One place that was too important to put off anymore. Yugakure. Sakura announced. Yup. It's time we figured out who the hell Jashin is. Chapter 64. It sprinkled rain as they moved further north, dusting the trees with dew and misting the air in a way that caused the ends of Sakura's hair to curl. This time, she'd remembered to pack umbrellas for the three of them, though Gaara still preferred to let his sand curl above him in a vague umbrella shape. It sometimes rained in Konoha during the fall, but it seemed as though northern fire country was far more humid. They stuck to the roads at first before meandering off, at first following the time-honored logic of not wanting to get lost, before eventually coming to the conclusion that if people saw them on the roads, word might spread, and if Akatsuki heard they were heading north that might lead to them being followed. It was with a bit of reluctance that Sakura left the roads. Traveling through the thick of the woods was rough on her legs, and there were bugs in the humid north that picked through her clothes and left welts on her skin. A price to pay for travel anonymity, one that she didn't mind paying, but definitely one she could gripe about. Still, there was an odd peace that settled upon their days. They were on a time limit, sure, but that time limit was more in the span of months rather than days or weeks. She wanted to reach Oto before Orochimaru could possess Sasuke's body. She wanted to reach the larger shinobi nations before Akatsuki had a chance to try and attack their Jinhuriki. But reaching places took time, and at the very least Sakura knew she had at least a year and a half, if not more, before Orochimaru could even try to take Sasuke. She didn't know Akatsuki's timeline, but considering it had been a year since Itachi had first approached Naruto, it could be assumed that they weren't rushed, simply biding their time for an opportunity. There were newer implications that Itachi might not be quite as loyal to Akatsuki as she'd originally thought, judging by the fact that Itachi had been ordered to kill his clan and hadn't simply snapped, but Sakura had yet to determine if Itachi had simply been loyal to Danzo or, well, it was an iffy situation no matter how you looked at it. Sakura couldn't justify slaughtering a clan to stop a civil war, she just couldn't, and maybe it was naive of her, but all Sakura could think of regarding the Uchiha was that something could have been done better to stop it. So no, she didn't know where Itachi stood. She didn't know enough. But she did know that the nations under her pact were sufficiently warned regarding Akatsuki, and while she didn't know the full spread of shinobi in the organization, she doubted even 9S-ranked deserters could take on the full might of a village, could they? Itachi took out an entire clan, but Oniki had fought Madara and lived to tell of it, and he had been more than eager to spread his strategies now that both living Uchiha were considered missing nin. Tsunade had also healed the damage caused by Itachi's genjutsu, which seemed to suggest she could heal herself if the need arose. Haiden seemed immortal, but he'd also seemed incapable of functioning with his head removed. Kakuzu was a wild card, seeing as he was old enough to be her great-grandfather and still was spry enough to be part of Akatsuki, but Shibuki had theories and had promised to inform both her and the other Kage once his theories solidified. Kisame had a sword that ate chakra, but Jiraiya had scared him off easily enough when he'd come for Naruto. And that left the weird Zetsu demon and the masked Cherry non-user from the Uchiha complex, whom Sakura was becoming more and more convinced might be her sensei's long-lost teammate. If the Zetsu was anything like the other demons, dealing with him would be a cakewalk. As for the masked Uchiha, teleportation was a bitch to deal with, but the more people around, the harder it was to use that ability to gain tactical advantage. Sakura had landed a good hit on him even with just Shikamaru and Emi at her side. The current theory was that there were 9 Akatsuki members, 1 for each tailed beast, and counting out who she knew, that left 3 mystery shinobi. However, Sakura wasn't going to be stupid enough to think they didn't have backup. 10, maybe 12 shinobi at least, and so far she had potential methods for dealing with each of the known ones. She was definitely being optimistic, but how could she not be? They'd taken down Danzo, they'd fixed Gaara's seal so he could sleep again, they'd successfully pulled 7 shinobi nations into an alliance. It hadn't been easy, but it sure felt like things were sort of naturally going their way. And maybe that was the true reason for the sense of peace that Sakura felt as they walked. Maybe it was the sense of accomplishment, the sense that she had gotten somewhere. It had only been a year since she'd left the village to research her enemies and help save her friends. A year, and things were already so different she could barely recognize herself. Would the Sakura of a year ago have laughed if she'd been told of the future? Of the Tsunade Jinhuriki, of the snarky boy from Root, now her best friends, now her team? That she was looking at a future without Sasuke in it and was strangely, alright with it? Where would she be another year from now? Alive still? Accomplished? Powerful? What are you thinking about? Sakura was dragged from her thoughts as Sai spoke up. You've got quite the pensive look on your face. He clarified. Or maybe it's not pensive, perhaps constipation. Sakura slapped his arm playfully. I'm thinking about the future, you dummy. Where we'll be a year from now. Following our projected route, we'll hopefully be somewhere on the south end of Kiri. Sai answered. Barring that we don't die or get otherwise delayed. Ha ha. I meant who we'd be as people. Who will have signed the pact? What we'll have learned. Maybe Gaara will have figured out the puzzle box by then. Gaara grunted at this, currently fiddling with said box as they walked. It was more difficult than a normal box, they'd figured out. It required chakra inputs at certain twists and turns, and the wrong input would reset the entire box. If anything, it was a rather decent exercise in chakra control, but as a Jinhuriki Gaara had never needed much to begin with. The boy was beyond frustrated, foregoing his newfound ability to sleep in favor of getting more time to try and work at the box. Shukaku, of course, had been quiet on the subject. But not quiet in general. In fact, Shukaku had taken his newfound freedom to provide commentary through Gaara whenever he deemed it appropriate. Whenever Gaara asked about the box, Shukaku simply insisted that it was a test, over and over again. "What do you think is in it?" "Something silly." "A gold leaf." Sai postulated. "Tanuki are mischievous, so they say. What better mischief than forcing someone to work for days for a mere trinket? Hey, a solid gold leaf could still pay for a couple nice nights at an inn." Sakura countered. "I've heard there's 100 onsen in Yogakure. We could have our pick." "There's 14. Sai corrected. "And an onsen would simply relax you into letting your guard down." "Steam." Sakura countered. "Even the sherry non is hindered in the mist." "You're so certain." "I've lived it, that's how I know." Sakura thought back to the Land of Waves, of how Kakashi had needed hounds to track down Zabuza in the mist, eyes rendered useless. Team 7's first mission involved fighting Mamaki Zabuza. He used mist to shield himself. "Ah." Sai nodded, pulling out his notebook to jot down notes. "The Byakugan has the advantage there, I suppose. Fog can't stop a Hyuga, but it can stop an Uchiha. It's a wonder the smoke from their fire jutsu never caused a hindrance. It might be prudent to learn a jutsu that creates smoke or fog. I'd imagine someone we know has access to a few. If not, we can always." "What?" petitioned Kiri. "I'm sure they'll be more than eager to share village jutsu after decades of being at war with every shinobi nation on the continent. Themselves included. We'll figure it out." Sakura stuck out her tongue. "But I admit, there's a reason I've put Kiri last on my list. Nobody's sure if they even have a cage anymore. Yogakure doesn't have a cage anymore either. Perhaps they'll be good practice." Sakura highly doubted that. Kiri was a nation devastated by war. You, in contrast, hadn't participated in any of the major wars. Her record of Yogakure indicated that they didn't have a cage due to a recent democratic decision to disband the Shinobi in favor of pacifism. There were still citizens that used chakra, mostly defending from bandits and occasionally performing odd jobs for the villages, but you prided itself on being the village that had forgotten war. Sakura would have figured that neighboring villages would have taken the change as an excuse to invade and take the lands for their own, but so far it appeared as though none had tried. She understood why Konoha didn't take advantage. Recovering from the Kyuubi attack and now suffering through 2 minor wars had set them back. Shinobi would be lost trying to take you, and even more lost to trying to maintain new borders that they were unfamiliar with. Sakura would have figured that Oto was, perhaps, too new to try invading another country, but Orochimaru had invaded Konoha, so that was blatantly not true. Sakura theorized there that Orochimaru simply had no interest in you like he had with Konoha. Oto was a surprisingly wealthy nation, dominating the rice trade and, less surprisingly so now knowing its leader, also exporting a fair amount of unique civilian technology. Sakura was sure none of the exports were the pinnacle of what Orochimaru had developed, but why not take advantage of outdated technology by selling it to those who weren't quite as caught up as you were? Yes, Sakura supposed it made sense that Orochimaru didn't have much interest in conquering you immediately, who had nothing to offer but economic benefit. Kyumo, on the other hand, was a mystery. Maybe they just liked having you as a barrier between them and other countries, maybe they were simply nicer than Konohan propaganda had given them credit for, or maybe it was something else entirely. Sakura just wasn't sure, but she was fairly certain that, with the possible exception of Akatsuki, you would be peaceful. A definite calm before some very intimidating storms. She would still be approaching the Yu leaders to discuss her treaty. Perhaps Yu wasn't an official shinobi nation any longer, but Sakura figured it would be rude to leave them out of things. They had shinobi in their history, and they were an important part of the world economy. Sakura hoped speaking with them would go quickly and smoothly. A pacifist nation would surely find no trouble signing into a multi-nation alliance. Sai was probably rubbing off on her, because a pessimist thought in her mind kept thinking that things looked a bit too easy, which meant something was going to go horribly wrong. For now, at least, Sakura let herself bask in peace of the journey. The forest gave way to fissures, worn into the earth by mighty rivers and majestic waterfalls. A large part of the U border met with the ocean, and many of the rivers that began in Iwa spiraled their way through the land until coming to a rest at U's shores. They made their way back to the road once they were sure they were within U proper, not wanting any of the country's patrols to think them suspicious, and in turn that set them on the path to pass many of U's various inns and resorts. Small towns had seemed to form around each resort, along with various fisheries and markets. It reminded Sakura that money was fairly scarce for her team, and if that ever changed in the future she wanted nothing more than to give every single one of the resorts here a try. She made compromise by deciding to allow herself a few nights at one of the resorts in the hidden village while she spoke with the U leaders. Yugakure itself was centered around a massive lake. Its buildings were built into the fissure walls and around the lakeside, and one building overall dominated the scenery, a multi-floored building that looked as though it might be a temple. The village guards informed her that it was a place of government, where the leaders met to address the country's needs and where citizens would come to elect new leaders every year. Leaders could be elected multiple years in a row, but it was entirely possible that a leader could be elected once and then never lead again, a concept that was admittedly strange to Sakura. A leader was supposed to be a constant, guiding force. How could anything get done when the country went through political upheaval every year? But things did get done, and you continued to prosper. Sakura supposed there was something to it that she simply missed, and maybe the more time she spent here, the more she'd be able to understand. They made their way to the temple building first. They had arrived in the early afternoon, and there was no reason to delay meeting with the leaders. It didn't take long to track them down. Upon entering the building they were gestured into a waiting room by the guards, and hardly any time passed at all before 3 people entered to greet them. The first 2 introduced themselves, and Sakura wished she had the clarity of mind to greet them properly, because upon seeing the third person, she was immediately overwhelmed with the sensation of memories. She had seen this man before, seen him in some strange sort of dream where he had been gathering herbs in a tall field. He had looked at her and told her that the village would be changing soon, that she wasn't yet ready for something. But he was older now, with shocks of gray dotting his hair and new wrinkles where there hadn't been any before. Yet he still wore the white kimono of her memory, as did the other 2 people, and more interestingly, he wore a rather familiar necklace, a black circle, with an inverted triangle within it. "I am Genkei, the 3rd representative of U." The man announced himself, and Sakura was even more surprised because she'd known the man's name before he said it. He noticed the recognition in her eyes, and she saw him glance downwards towards the matching necklace around her own neck. "And it seems as though a treaty won't be the only thing we'll be discussing today." Sakura Harino. Sakura forced herself to say. "And I suppose you're probably right. I'll prioritize your treaty, if you don't mind. We cannot actually make any decision on it without putting our council to a vote, so it's best we get that process started as soon as possible." The representatives were predictably amenable to the concept of the treaty, even more so considering the countries that had signed onto it already. Sakura allowed herself a breath of relief when the 3 promised they would bring up the treaty with the council immediately, and a further breath when they assured her that the country's stance would most likely be yes, as any step towards universal peace would be considered a worthy one. However, there would have to be some addendums made. You would likely want to keep its pacifist status, which meant that if war with an unallied nation did occur, you would be unwilling to send their own to help fight, regardless of any signed treaty. That of course led to some complications. If you was given special treatment and allowed to simply send supplies to allies during war, other countries might try to withhold military aid by just sending supplies of their own. Sakura drafted several potential compromises. They could send healers instead of fighters, people that would travel to villages and provide aid to wounded shinobi that were brought home away from the front lines. There could be a more general addendum made to the treaty. Countries without a military force would be held to different standards of the treaty than those with a military force. They would have to define guidelines for a military force, which would be a lot more work, but Sakura had expected to be continually drafting the treaty every time she reached a new country anyway. You could simply refuse to sign the treaty until all other countries were on board, thus lowering the risk that they'd be drawn into conflict anyway. The representatives had a copy of the treaty. Sakura would leave it in the hands of the U Council to come up with options that she could bring up with the rest of her allied nations. Sakura assured them that they had time, and she would stay in U for as long as it took for them to reach a preliminary agreement. To her delight, Genkei even often to host them. It isn't rare that we receive shinobi as tourists, but never before have we received ambassadors. We should set a precedent for treating them well, should we not? Genkei told her as they walked along the lakeshore. Genkei's house was built into the cliffside, but man had offered a scenic tour of Yogakure before closing them in for the night. We have been preaching for years that the future of the world should not be written in war. Within the past 100 years, shinobi have weathered 3 world wars, and you considered that far too many. We will destroy ourselves without balance. That balance is now being considered, Genkei smiled. I believe it will give many of us hope to see it. If your purpose here is peace, you will always be welcome in my home. Our purpose is peace. Sakura promised. But we've also come to warn. There is a mercenary group that opposes us, and they're hunting Jinhyuriki as well. Akatsuki. Genkei replied with a nod. They will not come here. Even if they have reason to. You're so certain. We have a factor in our favor. I'm assuming you know of Haiden. He's the one that gave this to me. Sakura reached up to touch her amulet. I actually came here for some answers about him and his religion. But he's part of Akatsuki. Exactly. Genkei agreed. Haiden, he disagrees with our village politics, but he will not allow harm to come to his home, whether he outwardly admits it or not. I am quite certain he has worked to convince his leader that we are not worth their time. And for the most part, we are not. We have no Jinhyuriki. We have little military power. This country is a neutral haven, and even Akatsuki would be loath to make themselves unwelcome here. I guess that's comforting. Sakura glanced towards Gaara. They hadn't been open about his status as a Jinhyuriki, but at this point she felt like it was becoming common knowledge anyway, and Genkei had insinuated as such. If Genkei was so certain they were safe, she was tempted to believe that there was some amount of truth to his words. And within the borders of a village was definitely safer than alone in the woods. You mentioned wanting to know of Haiden's religion. Yes. Literally anything at all. Haiden mentioned that Jashin's worshippers lived here in U, and I could get more answers if I went to them. He was correct. Jashin's followers live north of here. The first step to reaching their temple is to find his worshippers here in Yogakure. Genkei gestured to his own necklace. I studied with them for over a decade before I returned to serve as a shinobi for you. Believe it or not, there are many worshippers here. Most simply keep their prayers to themselves. It painted a different picture in her mind of Genkei, knowing that he'd studied under Jashinism for a decade. Haiden had mentioned Jashin was a god of pain, demanding total annihilation of one's foes. How could you be a pacifist nation if many of its worshippers followed this philosophy? You look confused. I feel like I might not have the whole picture. Knowing Haiden, I believe that. Genkei laughed. He was my student once, you see. A genin under my command, before Yu's military was dissolved. He reacted more passionately than most when this happened, and I became afraid, for a time, that he might fall down a dark path without proper guidance. Haiden thrived on the thrill of battle. He was a shinobi that would have flourished in any other nation than Yu. Thankfully, for him, there was another option. I sent him to the temple of Jashin, and there he found a greater purpose. There, perhaps, you will find greater purpose. Genkei refused to speak more on the subject, despite Sakura's prying. He drew a route for her to follow on their map, but more than that, he claimed, was for her to find out when she arrived there. They ended up staying in Yogakure for 3 days. It only took 2, technically, for the U Council to decide on options for joining with the treaty, and from there they claimed it would have to be put to a country-wide vote. There would be 2 stages of voting, one to decide if they should join the treaty and potentially forego straight pacifism in favor of keeping peace, the other to decide what amendments to request so that you could stay true to their ideals. They spent the 3rd day being treated to the amenities of an onsen, courtesy of the U Council. As Genkei had told them, a precedent needed to be set for how ambassadors were treated, and U was united in the belief that they be treated well. Sakura certainly didn't have any complaints about that. On the morning of the 4th day, Genkei took them to the village gates to see them off. Sakura asked him one more time if he could tell them anything at all about the Jashin religion, to which Genkei said only one thing. Don't let your guard down. They walked for another day, leaving the main road from the village and branching into a side ravine that was more craggy stone than actual path. Genkei had been exact in drawing the route, but despite this Sakura still found herself doubting the path until they came across a crudely drawn symbol on the cliff wall, the circle with the inverted triangle. A sign, hopefully, that they were on the right track. There was a strange sense of foreboding that crept over them with every step, enough so that even Sai ran out of quips to say. Shikaka was oddly quiet, and Gaara put down his puzzle box in favor of keeping on high alert. On top of that, Sakura couldn't help but notice that she felt pulsing. Like the pulsing of a heartbeat, echoing through the ravine walls and reverberating with her very body. At one point Sakura sent out a sensing pulse of her own, and the result was a feedback of chakra so intense that it stunned her for a good minute. Whatever was going on, there was a massive concentration of something here. Even more disturbing was that neither Gaara or Sai felt this pulsing at all. Sakura kept close to the boys with that realization. Whatever was going on with her, whatever power had been bestowed on her, it was both thrilling and terrifying that it applied to her and her alone. With everything that she knew, would she regret seeking answers? Or would this be the key to something greater, as Genkei had suggested? They reached their destination as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the craggy path. The ravine dipped downwards, and all at once a deep canyon was revealed to them, and within it the largest statue Sakura had ever seen. It was a statue of a man, and at first Sakura was convinced it was the Sage of Six Paths. There were the trademark two horns protruding from the man's head, and he was wearing a long robe adorned with familiar Magatama symbols. However, unlike the sage, this man's hair was long and flowed down his back, and the staff that he carried was slightly different than the sage's. Instead of various rings on a hooped end, this staff had two protruding crosses. Finally, Sakura did not see the signature third eye on the man's forehead. This was not the Sage of Six Paths. But he was similar. The statue itself had to be at least a couple 100 feet tall, only dwarfed by the massive canyon walls surrounding it. At the statue's feet looked to be a temple building, similar to the one she had seen in Yogakure. The temple, however, looked strangely dark. Sakura wished she could use her sensing jutsu, but another quick pulse confirmed that there was too much of something around for her to pick up on any signs of life. He's familiar. Shikaka spoke through Gaara. Like Hagoromo, but... Hagoromo? Sakura made to ask further, but all at once, Gaara's sand rushed around them, and she heard a loud thunk as something embedded itself in the shield. An arrow. Gaara announced, allowing the arrow to fall to the ground in front of them. It was larger than most arrows Sakura had seen, and the arrowhead was of an unusual shape, as though parts of it had fanned out upon hitting the sand. If that sort of arrow hits flesh, it would hurt to pull out. Sai bent over to pick up the arrow, not even flinching as another one was intercepted by Gaara's defense. If it doesn't kill, it causes pain. Appropriate, from what we know of these people. 7 more arrows flew their way before the volley stopped, each coming from slightly different angles and directions. As the final arrow flew, a figure landed on the road in front of them, wielding a massive bow and a satchel full of the strange arrows. Her attire was strange. She wore a thick black jacket with a furred hood, and a casual white shirt and pants that looked more like they belonged to a civilian than a shinobi. Nice shield. The figure, a tall, scarred woman, spoke in a tone that seemed both amused and frustrated. Not many people can block my arrows so well. But is defense all you got, or do you actually know how to have a good time? The woman then held the bow in front of her, and with a strange click, the string retracted and the bow split into 2 parts. The woman wielded one part in each hand, and it was only then that Sakura realized that the bow was somehow bladed, and now the woman was essentially wielding 2 swords. Wait! Sakura called out, rushing forward and holding her amulet at the ready. I was sent here by Haiden and Genkei. We're here to learn about Jashinism. Oh. The woman looked to the amulet, and a sadistic grin pulled across her face. Excellent. It's been a long time since we've tested a potential. She shifted into a fighting stance, and behind her 4 more warriors appeared, also wearing similarly strange attire and holding intimidating weaponry. First test, recruit. the woman announced. Reach the temple alive and we might consider you worthy of our attention. The more of us you take down in the process, the higher your score will be. Got it, dips hits. Sakura swallowed and drew a kunao, falling into a fighting stance of her own. Gaara's sand swirled at the ready, and next to her she saw Sai ready his brush and ink. We got it, Sai replied. Piss brain. The woman grinned. Oh, I think we're going to like you. Chapter 65. A boy charged them first, who couldn't have been much older than they were, wielding the largest hammer Sakura had ever seen in her life. Gaara's sand flew up with plenty of time to intercept it, and despite the size the hammer didn't even remotely seem to make a dent. The boy, however, smirked. He reached into a pouch at his hip and drew several strips of paper bombs, and slapped them onto the flat of the hammer. They began to sizzle, and Sakura had mere seconds to brace herself. The boy raised his arms back and slammed the hammer against the sand in time with the bomb's detonation, and this time Gaara's shield almost burst from the effort of taking the blow. Though the force of the blow didn't hit them directly, the wind pressure from the attack sent the three of them reeling. Shit. Sakura cursed aloud. Was this boy going to blow up the whole mountain with that damned thing? Around her she saw rubble crumbling down the cliffsides, and the boy himself had singe marks on his clothing and even on his face from the blow. Despite this, the boy looked excited, perhaps even maniacal. It reminded her of the look Hayden had gotten as she watched him fight Hiroshi. Definitely cut from the same cloth. And the boy was already pulling out more paper bombs to slap on that abomination of a hammer. Sakura moved to draw a kunao, but by the time she was rearing back to throw, the boy swung a second time, clashing once more with Gaara's sand. This time Sakura was slightly more prepared for the blast, but the force of it was still enough to send her scooting back in the dirt several inches. She looked forward just in time to see an even scarier side effect of the weapon. The heat and force of the blast was melting Gaara's sand at the impact point, which meant that every successful hit gave Gaara less sand to work with. If they kept this up, Gaara's shield wouldn't last, and though Gaara was capable of mixing his sand with soil to create more earth to work with, they were in a ravine, and the earth beneath them was hard and difficult to mold. Sai, thankfully, had already begun to draw, and before the boy could draw up a third set of paper bombs, an inked bird flew directly into his eyes and caused him to stagger. Push forward. Sai insisted. They told us to aim for the temple. He was right, the temple was their true goal, not these fighters, and of course they'd send the fucking exploding hammer in first, if only to root them and cause them to move further away from the goal. However, this reminder alone caused Sakura to realize something. The hammer was large, which meant the boy could only swing it so fast, and he had to prepare the bombs before activating them. It was intimidating, but after having weathered the first few blows it had been easy enough for Sai to aim and get a pot shot in. Not only that, but only the boy had moved in, with the others on standby as though it was currently their job to just sit and watch. It was almost like they weren't really trying to kill them, simply scare them off. And then it clicked, because of course the Jashinists would have an intimidating hazing ritual for potential recruits. The first few shots from the woman would have killed any curious bandits, and once Sakura had shown her medallion and announced her intent, then the woman had summoned her band and announced the exercise. They wouldn't just kill potential recruits, not before getting a chance to assess their skills and find out if they were worthy. It was a test. A flashy, explosive one meant to test their mettle. Sai was right, they had to push forward if they wanted to pass. Not only that, but the woman had stated they got extra points for disabling opponents. They wanted bold, they wanted brave, they wanted fighting prowess and skill on top of the ability to maintain one's composure and push past an enemy. There was a part of Sakura that wondered if she could just convince Gaara to rush the five with his sand and quickly crush them, like he used to do a year ago. But that wasn't really proving her own power, and it wasn't Gaara who had dragged them here to figure out answers. Sakura was the one with the amulet, the one with strange visions and interesting powers, the one who had spoken to Hayden and learned where she'd needed to go. She needed to prove that she was worthy of entering the temple. "Cover me," she told the boys, stowing away her kunao. She had a plan now, and she'd always been a good test taker. Sakura pushed Chakra towards her legs and threw herself forward, reaching the boy in front of her and grabbing not him, but the hammer. With the ink in his eyes, the boy couldn't put up much resistance, and that meant Sakura could disarm him and get an asset for herself. She yanked the hammer from his hands, only buckling a little under the weight of the new weapon, and in the same rushing motion arced it forward in an attack towards the enemies ahead. The hammer hadn't been primed with bombs yet, but it appeared as though the others had an instinctive reaction to back away when the hammer was swung, as each of them hopped away in anticipation. Behind her, she caught a glimpse of Sai knocking out the enemy boy with quick strike to the head, and with that her boys caught up and they had regained the ground they'd lost. And now Sakura had a hammer. She hadn't been trained in handling large weapons, of course, but there was still something kind of empowering about wielding one nonetheless. And while her current idea was admittedly a stupid one, Sakura liked the idea of turning an enemy's weapon against them. She stopped just long enough to offer the flat of the hammer to Sai, who in turn got a knowing glint in his eye and pulled out paper bombs of his own to donate. "Gaara, put me in the air." She rushed forward, and in front of her Gaara's sand flowed to make a staircase. She leaped when she reached the top of it, letting both gravity and her own strength bring the hammer in a downward arc towards the group, right as Sai's bombs primed to detonate. The enemies dodged it, of course, which Sakura had been expecting. She hadn't wanted to hit them with the blow, after all. The hammer struck the ground, and the full force of the blast suddenly pushed Sakura upwards and forwards through the air, over her opponents and directly towards the temple. For a moment, she wondered if things could really be that easy. But before she landed on the ground, she felt something wrap around her ankle and pull her sharply downwards, causing her to slam onto her back rather than land neatly on her feet. "Nice try, but not good enough." The man who'd spoken up was wielding a long chain in both hands. It took a brief moment for Sakura to realize that there were hooked barbs among some of the links, and that the pain she was now feeling on top of the soreness of the fall was coming from the metal digging into her skin. Shit, that's not coming out easy. Definitely a weapon meant to maim, not kill. Keep her pinned down or else risk tearing veins and arteries trying to remove the chain. A part of Sakura wished she knew a lightning jutsu. A small shock down the chain would easily force the man to let go, that she knew from experience now, but of course she had to have been born an earth type. Which meant, right now, leaving it in until she could get to safety behind Gaara's sand was her only option. She couldn't risk removing it in battle. But she'd dealt with worse pain, she realized. Absolutely nothing could top several doses of lightning jutsu directly into her nervous system, and Sakura found a simple pleasure in watching the look on the man's face as she stood up without even bothering to address her wound. "Nice try," she retorted, grinning. "But not good enough." Her boys were running to catch up, which gave her an opportunity. Sakura's hands weaved a series of signals, at the same time molding chakra into her mouth, and fired several water bullets directly at the man's face. He ducked and weaved, of course, and Sakura gritted her teeth as the chain moved with him, but the bullets had just been a distraction. Gaara's sand weaved its way around the man's arms and she saw the sand constrict tightly. The man didn't even yell or cry out, to his credit, and Sakura wasn't sure if Gaara had broken bones or just squeezed tightly enough to cause pain, but it was still enough to make him drop the chain. Sakura quickly reached down and began to bundle it before anyone else could make a grab for it. At the same time, she saw Sai in the distance, sending several waves of inked tigers at the other fighters to keep them at bay. There was currently nobody between her and the temple, but Sakura wasn't sure if she could limp her way there before an enemy fought their way around the boys. But, they were in a canyon. There was a lot of hard earth beneath their feet, and even though Gaara's sand was limited in capacity, if the two of them worked together. "Sai, head for the air," Sakura called out, forcing her shaking legs into a stance. She let chakra begin to build in her hands, and prepared herself to mold the earth in front of her. "Gaara, let's cut them off." Gaara was by her side in an instant, Shukaku's chakra flaring up around him. She started flowing through hand signs, and to her surprise and curiosity she saw Gaara mimicking her and going through the same. So Gaara wasn't using his sand for the wall. A potential advantage, she noted, if the wall didn't work and their enemies tried to cut them off again. They both slammed their hands to the ground at the same time, and Sakura could feel the rush of Shukaku's chakra alongside her own as they summoned forth walls of earth. The wall spread across the ravine just in time to separate them from the enemy. Sakura took the brief moment of reprieve to take a deep breath. Her leg ached, but they'd bought some time. She saw Sai, aloft on a giant inked bird, narrowly dodge a few kunao as he cleared the wall. As he landed next to them, he smiled. Kind of an easy test, wasn't it? Ha, ha, you don't have several daggers in your leg. Sakura retorted. And we're not quite there yet. Sai offered her a hand. Well, we can rectify that. Sakura gladly took his hand, sitting down on the back of his bird as Gaara climbed on as well. From there, the bird lazily flew them towards the temple entrance, reaching it just as their attackers had managed to scale the wall behind them. Sai dismissed the bird, then turned to give the pursuers a cheeky wave. They each took a confident step through the temple's entrance, and then heard an ominous click as one of the tiles sank beneath Sakura's foot. Shit. Gaara's sand rushed around them in an ultimately futile gesture as the ground opened up beneath their feet. Sakura felt the lurch of gravity and frantically tried to reach for solid ground, at the same time feeling Sai grab onto her. They were in freefall for only a few moments before Gaara's sand caught up and formed a platform beneath them, but by then the trapdoor above them had already begun to close. It was but a few moments later before the trio were submerged into darkness. So, what were you saying about the test being easy, Sai? We got into the temple. We technically passed the test. The first test, we should have known the Demontranced was trapped. For all we know, we just narrowly avoided a spiked pit or something down there. Considering they intended for their potential recruits to be rushing for the entrance, I doubt they'd lay a trap that killed those that were successful. I would assume that the second test is escaping the trap. Great. Do you want to try to pry the ceiling open? Let's start with being able to see. There was a small click as Sai turned on a flashlight, and light spilled into the chamber. There were tight walls all around them, and of course Gaara's sand beneath them, but beyond Gaara's sand she saw not spikes, but a long tunnel with a slide that led deeper into the mountain. You're probably right, Sai, they did intend for us to fall for it. Sakura concluded as she squinted into the darkness. And if we want to know more, we probably need to play along with their games. But first, she grimaced. Mind getting this stupid chain off my leg? The barbs took a gentle hand to remove, but thankfully Sai was more than capable. As Sai got to work bandaging it, Gaara used his sand to slowly take them down the slide. The tunnel eventually evened out, going forward instead of going downward, and in the distance Sakura caught sight of light. The tunnel eventually opened up, dumping them into what appeared to be a fairly large barred cell. Easy enough to break through the bars, and Sakura was already contemplating the best way to force them apart, but her thoughts were interrupted by who she saw on the other side. It was a man, an older man with hair as pure white as snow. He wore simple white robes and carried a tall, black staff, the very same staff that the man depicted in the statue outside had wielded. This man, however, was clearly different. There were no horns upon his brow, and his robes did not have the distinct Megatama pattern upon them. The man did, however, have unusual, pupil-less eyes that distinctly reminded her of the Byakugan of all things. Sakura Harano. The man announced, stating her name rather than inquiring it. Gaara. Sai. He nodded towards each of the boys in turn. You are earlier than we expected, I think. This bodes well. About 1,000,000 questions ran through Sakura's mind at once, the foremost of which being how did he know their names, but before she could speak up the man held up a hand to quiet her. I am Shiro Atsutsuki, one of the Jushisai of Jashin's temple. You have injured your leg, so perhaps you will first allow me to lead you to one of our healers. There, I will answer whatever questions you may have. It was definitely a tempting offer, though Sakura was a bit wary. They'd gone from a hot-blooded fight to a sudden offer of healing and answers, a stark sort of whiplash that seemed a bit too good to be true. Sakura found herself reaching for the handle of her kunao, calming herself by running her fingers over the metal. She made to speak, but before she could she felt a sudden burst of chakra, angry chakra, and it was Gaara who stood forward to speak with Shukaku's low growl. And who are you to dare take on the name of the Sage of Six Paths? I believe the correct term would be a grandnephew of sorts. An amused smile came to the man's face, and he turned his hand to silence Gaara and Shukaku instead. Peace, Shukaku. I mean not to dishonor the name of the one whom you know as Hag Oromo. Much as Hag Oromo fathered two sons that founded the names of Uchiha and Senjo, so too did his younger brother, Hamura, father 2 daughters. One such daughter left these lands to found the clan of Hyuga. The other remained here, and carried on the name of Itsutsuki. I am descended from that daughter, as are several others that make their home here within these caverns. Hamura. Shikaku's voice seemed uncertain, and she saw Gaara's face twinge with confusion. Hagoromo mentioned a brother once, but never the name. Then I dare say you have plenty of questions. Shiro then stepped forward, unlocking the door to the chamber and pulling it slowly open. But first, your wounds, Sakura. And perhaps a warm meal. We have much to discuss, and I know you have traveled quite a long way. Sakura was still wary, but the prospect of answers was too enticing to turn down. She stepped forward, determined. I'm here for answers. She decided. Lead the way. The tunnels were warm, and there was a faint mist about them that Shiro informed them was due to the presence of several underground hot springs. Sakura caught a glimpse of one of them as they walked, as well as the sight of 2 warriors balancing on the water's surface with bow staves, sparring with a ferocious intensity. The Hagashisai. Shiro spoke before she could ask. You met several of their number on your way in. I must apologize for their roughness. They keep out intruders and test potential converts, and despite the fact that they knew of your coming, I have no doubt that they wanted to see what you were capable of. I hope you do not look upon them too harshly. They could use better security. Sai commented, and Sakura winced at the bluntness of the statement. If we 3 could get in, so could most skilled shinobi. Most skilled shinobi do not know we exist. Shiro countered. It was only through your brush with our Haiden that you know of us at all, and only due to the presence of your amulet that Ginkai gave you the means to find us. Those who stumble upon our temple by accident are usually bandits who fall easily to our temple traps, if our warriors do not get to them first. And the natural energy that runs throughout our caverns is more than capable of shielding our signatures from the most adept of sensors. Natural energy. Sakura remembered the overwhelming amount of chakra she had sensed outside, but natural energy, that was supposed to be everywhere, and it had never interfered with her sensing before. How is it that so much natural energy gathers here? Our temple lies upon a nexus. Shiro explained, looking back at her with a gentle smile. There are many nexus points throughout the world. The majority of these points have been settled by the sage colonies. These colonies are made up of chakra-sensitive animals that have served as companions for shinobi since before shinobi ever existed. Several more of these nexus points are hidden and notoriously difficult to access. Natural energy builds within the earth and seeps upward into the world through soil and rock. This energy is taken up by plants and recycled into the world as plants are devoured by living creatures. And upon death, the energy is recycled once more into the soil. Due to this process, many of the nexus points are located deep within the earth. It is only due to the natural tunnels created over hundreds of years that humans were able to find this nexus. That, of course, and my ancestors' uncanny ability to sense the patterns of natural energy within the earth. But what creates that energy to begin with? Ah, what an insightful question. One I wish I could answer. I can provide you with our theories, if you wish. Our priests have debated this for generations, but alas we cannot dig far enough into the earth to learn the answer. Not enough air to breathe, and the ground itself grows hotter with every foot that you dig downward. Onaki-sensei had a theory about that. Sakura grew excited as she remembered her sensei's teaching. He believes that there's hot magma at the center of the planet, and that's why it gets hotter on the way down. He actually had an entire mining division dedicated to researching it. He referred to it as the core of the planet. Indeed. And perhaps it is this core that produces the energy somehow, but the how and why of it, we do not know. Shiro suddenly stopped, gesturing for Sakura to enter a room to his right. But for now, have a seat, and allow me to attend you. We have plenty of time to discuss the origin of natural energy, rest assured. Well, that's probably not the top priority. No, most assuredly not. But it is a worthy topic of discussion nonetheless. The room had a small pool of steaming water in the center of it, and floating within the pool were dozens of porcelain bowls. As they floated across the water, they occasionally bumped into each other, creating a unique harmony of ringing sounds that was soothing to listen to. Around the pool were several chairs, as well as many tatami mats. A meditation room of sorts, Sakura deduced, though for now they were the only ones there. Shiro gestured for Sakura to sit in one of the chairs before kneeling down and placing his hands upon her legs. A green glow covered his hands, and the pain in Sakura's leg slowly began to bleed away. Simple medical jutsu, Shiro explained, which is more than sufficient for treating minor wounds such as these. For more invasive wounds, we of the Jushisai have more drastic techniques. I shall hope in your time here that I need not use them upon you. Thanks. Sakura stretched her leg, noting with a smile that the wounds had closed completely. So long as nobody tries to kill us again. Oh, I unfortunately cannot guarantee that. Shiro answered with a chuckle. The Hagashisai can be fairly belligerent at times, but as you are Jashin's chosen, I do not believe they will be quite as inclined as they usually are. Sakura's eyes narrowed. Chosen? Yes. One of two. It is why I know of you, why all of us know of you. It is why you have found yourself beset by visions you cannot explain. Why you found remarkable power in dire moments. Why you are here, now, so desperate for answers. You are not here by chance, Sakura Harino. You are here by Jashin's design. I find that hard to believe. Sai piped up. Sakura didn't initially leave her home because some vision spurred her on. It was by chance she met Haiden at all. Chance, indeed. Shiro nodded. But choice to leave. Choice to speak with Haiden and learn more. Choice to pursue the unification of the shinobi world. Choice to root out the evil that had spread within Konoha's borders. Sakura, you were chosen because of the choices you made. You were led here because Jashin believes you worthy to be his own. Given strength because you have proven yourself worthy of it. Sakura flushed slightly pink at the praise. There was a thought in her mind that there were far more worthy shinobi than herself, but Shiro didn't lie. She was pursuing peace, she did start the Konoha revival operation, and perhaps those things were worthy of acknowledgement. But how do you know about all of this? Sakura demanded. How could news of what happened in Konoha possibly have reached here before we did? We came straight here. You already know the answer to that, don't you, Sakura? Sakura bit her lip as she thought. Visions, Shiro had mentioned, she'd had visions. She'd seen visions of the past. Visions of the present. Seen the world through other people's eyes. Sakura. She looked up towards Gaara and Sai, both of whom looked concerned and worried. He's right. Sakura answered. He's right, but I don't know how it's possible. I didn't even really know it was happening until recently, it was like they were just some strange dreams. You mentioned dreams. Gaara reminded her. But you'd never said what they were. I didn't know, I still don't know. Then perhaps we should begin there. Shiro gently took hold of her hands and helped her to her feet. You want answers, Sakura, and I can give them. But perhaps it would serve you better if you found answers directly from the source. You are here, now, and you have answered Jashin's call. Now you must let him speak to you, if you are ready. If you are willing. Sakura looked to her boys once again, but at this point her mind was already made up. She'd come too far to say no. I'm ready. And willing. Good. Then come this way. In the back of the cave were several paper seals, and upon placing his hand in the center of them, the wall of the cave melted away to reveal a passageway. Shiro led them through it, deeper and deeper into the earth until Sakura could no longer hear the soothing melody of the bowls in the pond, could hear nothing at all but their footsteps and stillness. The passageway slowly opened up, and eventually she found herself within a massive chamber. The first thing she noticed, something that was perhaps impossible to miss, was a massive altar, upon which rested an enormous deposit of black stone. Obsidian, Sakura recognized, and it was with a sudden realization that she noted that her amulet was also obsidian made, perhaps even from this very deposit, judging by the cuts and indentations along its sides. In front of the altar sat two candles, one whose wax was black, the other white. Both were lit, but unlike the other candles lighting the room, the wax on these candles did not seem to melt. Sakura's eyes were drawn to the white candle, and she was reminded of the pulsing again, a deep pulsing that was still echoing in her bones, demanding that she step closer and see. Come, Sakura. Sit before the altar and make yourself comfortable. Sakura did so, sitting herself cross-legged on the long mat that lay in front of the altar. Shiro sat next to her in a similar position, and behind her she noted Gaara and Sai sit as well. This altar is a nexus. It is a position of great natural strength. Can you feel it, Sakura? Feel the echo of chakra beneath the stones. Yes. Sakura answered. She closed her eyes, letting the pulsing rhythm of the room wash over her. It's overwhelming. Good. Focus on the echo. Keep very still, if you can, and breathe. Try to match the rhythm of the energy with every breath you take. Sakura did so. It was difficult at first, clearing her mind and forcing her breath to match the rhythm that seemed to get more and more intense with each passing moment. She felt her heart pounding in her chest, could hear the steady crackle of the fire of the candles around her, and the pulsing, again and again and again. But with time, breathing to the rhythm became easier. She felt a sort of relief as her body matched its pace, and where the pulsing was overwhelming before, now it seemed to fade into the background, steady, never leaving, always there, but not overbearing. What now? She asked, her eyes still closed for fear of breaking the calm she'd allowed to wash over herself. Shiro did not answer, so she forced her eyes open as she turned to face him. Hey, what n-? Shiro was gone. Everyone was gone, everything was gone. There was only blackness around her now. Sakura panicked, quickly standing to her feet and reaching for a kunai. Had this all been a trick? Was this a genjutsu, perhaps? She pressed her hands together and tried to force her chakra from her system, but she couldn't feel her chakra anymore. It was like she'd been cut from it completely. Hey! She called out, desperately. What the hell is going on? What have you done to me? She turned, and then she saw the obsidian stone again. It was large, towering over her, at least 20 feet in height. Despite the darkness around her, Sakura could see her reflection within the stone. She saw the frightened look in her eyes, saw her hands shakily clutching her kunai close to her chest, her legs shifted into a battle stance. And she saw a mark at the center of her forehead, a mark that spread outwards and began to cover her face in strange stripes and circles, downwards across her neck and eventually spreading across her entire body. And then Sakura saw something creeping up on her reflection, long twisting vines that wrapped around her arms and legs and pulled her back in a sudden, jerking motion, twisting everything out of her view. Then she saw herself sitting cross-legged before the altar, Shiro next to her, and Sakura had been quiet for a while now. Was she all right? That man hadn't done something to her, had she? She reached out towards herself, but Shiro turned and put a finger to his lips. It would be unwise to disturb her, Sai. Jashin has blessed her with visions. If you wake her now, we will need to start the process over again. Visions? Sai. She was looking through Sai's eyes. Of course, that was what had always happened when the visions occurred, looking through the eyes of another, believing herself to be that person until the vision had passed. She had seen through Sai and Gaara before, seen through others too, others she didn't know, others she did know, but how? How was it possible? Could she see through anyone's eyes? And what of the visions of the past? And what about the future? Why don't we have such visions? She heard herself, no, Sai ask aloud. Can we not meditate and receive them as well? You can. Shiro answered. But as Sakura is Jashin's chosen, they will come more easily to her. She has many questions now, and they will take time to answer. I would suspect, as of now, she is currently looking through the eyes of one of you, so that Jashin may help her understand the nature of her visions. Through our eyes. Precisely. She saw Shiro look Sai in the eyes, and Sakura could have sworn there was a knowing glint there, as though he knew she could hear this somehow. All humans share chakra from one source. At the beginning of all things was the rabbit princess, Kaguya, and from her came Hagi Oromo and Hamura, and from they came all shinobi. So long as one bears the chakra inherited from the rabbit princess, so it is that they are connected to their fellows. So it is that we can understand each other. So it is that Jashin can allow us to see through each other's eyes. It is through this connection that Sakura likely watches us now. Chakra from the rabbit princess, the mother of the Sage of Six Paths. Like the murals in Takigakuer. Sakura looked down suddenly, and saw that Sai was holding up his hands to reveal 8 of his fingers outstretched. Well, if she's really seeing through our eyes, she'll know how many fingers I'm holding up when I ask her. No doubt about it. Shiro chuckled to himself. As he has with all his priests, Jashin will show her the present. Then, as he has with all his chosen, Jashin will show her the past. It will take time, so I would get comfortable. Shiro's voice echoed, and Sakura blinked, and the scene around her began to shift again, rapidly at first. She saw familiar scenes, the battle that had taken place outside the temple, quickly interchanging viewpoints between herself, Sai, and Gaara. She saw the battle against Danzo, saw through Naruto's eyes, saw through Ino's eyes, saw even through Danzo's eyes as Naruto rushed down upon him with the full force of the Rasen Shuriken and felt pain, blistering pain as the jutsu tore through his body. She saw her battle against the masked man in the Uchiha compound, her battle against Itachi and Kisame, her battle against the Takigakuer demons, her training with Oniki, her battle with Hiroshi. It was as if time was slowly rewinding and she was seeing her past through different perspectives, the perspectives of her friends, her enemies, everyone. She saw 5 of her friends, shinobi she had grown up with, and she saw through Naruto's eyes as he promised her that he would bring Sasuke back. She saw through the eyes of each as they took on Orochimaru's henchmen in turn, and then the scene shifted and she was standing upon a great statue of Hashirama Senju, calling out Sasuke's name with all the fury and despair that she could manage. And then she heard Sasuke's name being called behind her, and she was standing in turn on top of a great statue of Madara Uchiha, and she turned to see Naruto behind her, annoying, troublesome Naruto who just couldn't let things be, couldn't let him pursue what only Orochimaru could give. She saw through each of their eyes as they charged each other, trading blow after blow, building chakra in their hands and roaring with unbridled rage and sorrow as they thrust their jutsu against each other. When I'm with you, I think it's kind of like having a brother. I can't bring you into this, Naruto, this darkness is my burden to bear. Darkness. Burden. Curse. It was dark, and though there was no rain there was a deep rumble of thunder in the distance that echoed even over the roar of the river. Across the river, he stood. He'd been expecting this, he'd been expecting him to come. This was the only way to show him. This was the only way to make him see. And then Sakura was the man, and her heart ached as she saw him for the first time in a year. Where had he been, where had he gone, and why had he suddenly shown up now after all this time, daring her to come find him out in the unclaimed wilds? Madara, she whispered, knowing the man would hear her despite the roar around them. The man turned and grinned, and she was seeing through his eyes again. She felt jubilation at seeing her partner's face again, seeing the one man who could contest him, the one man who had ever brought him joy and passion, the one man who could potentially understand. She screamed out his name to the heavens, in a laughing, maniacal manner. Hashirama! She spread her arms wide, as though inviting him to come closer. I've found the answer, she announced with glee. The answer to everything, hidden within my clan's heritage stone. We can end this conflict forever. We can bring peace to the shinobi world and build the world into what we always desired. I have seen it. I know what I must do. The vision snapped in and out of focus, and she was Hashirama again, and had Madara gone absolutely mad? Madara, what have you done? She pleaded. The Kyuubi will destroy the village if you allow it near. The village we worked to create. The village means nothing now. None of it will matter. Once I have the power of the tailed beasts within me, I can wrest all the world under my thumb, and there will never be war again. He really had gone mad, and Sakura ached, for whatever had been left of Madara before his defeat at the hands of the Tsuchikage, whatever was left of her friend, it was gone now, gone beneath red, spiraling eyes. No, Madara. She shook her head. This won't bring peace. This will only make you a tyrant. Come home, Madara. Come home and stand by my side and let us do this right. But she knew, then, that Madara would not come. Madara had been lost. Sakura saw battle through the eyes of the two men, a great, ferocious battle that was unlike anything she'd ever experienced in her lifetime. She felt power flow through her fingertips and forests raised at her command, she felt chakra bleed into her eyes and the Kyuubi bowed beneath her will. She swung her gunbei, and she swung her massive sword, and she clashed with herself through the men, again and again, until exhaustion bled into her and she felt that if she took another step that she might drop dead from the effort of it, but she forced chakra into her limbs and moved even when her body would not. She couldn't take on Madara and the Kyuubi, she thought to herself as she watched through Hashirama's eyes. She would have to rely on her after all. And then Sakura saw through the eyes of a third person, and she painted a seal upon her stomach and pushed chakra through the matrices, creating a vortex of power that would even draw the damned Kyuubi in. If she was to be the wife of the great Hokage, she would earn her place through will and blood. She was Mito Uzumaki, the princess of the land of whirlpools and master of the sealing arts, and not even the Kyuubi would resist her will. She screamed in triumph and agony as the beast was pulled into her body, and she felt the white-hot rage of chakra seeping into her own, fueling her and poisoning her all at once. She felt betrayal as she saw through Madara's eyes once again. Hashirama hadn't come alone, he'd brought her with him, and now the Kyuubi was gone and his body ached and his Sharingan was bleeding. "I can do it, Hashirama," he begged. "The infinite Tsukuyomi can make the world perfect, don't you see? No more war, no more politics, nothing to stop us." "No, Madara." She was Hashirama again, tears clouding her vision but not her will. "That's not peace. It is a lie. An illusion. Then kill me now. Kill me here and now or I will make my dreams a reality until my dying breath comes, and I will not allow you nor anyone else to stop me." Sakura closed her eyes and swung her blade. When she opened her eyes again, she was Azura Otsutsuki, and her blade stopped just inches from her brother's throat. She couldn't do it, she couldn't kill him, no matter how far he had fallen, no matter how dark he had become. Her heart still ached, and she turned away from him. "Go," she demanded. "And do not make this mistake again." And then she was Indra Otsutsuki, bitter with defeat and seething with malice. If she could not be her father's successor, then she would build something far greater than anything Azura could build, if only to prove him wrong. She would father a clan that would surpass the world in skill and talent and strength, and one day when his clan ruled everything, then would his spirit be allowed rest. She blinked and she was Hage Oromo Otsutsuki, and before her were 9 beasts, made from the chakra she had stored within her for decades, now given life and mind. There is darkness in humanity, and we may never be free of it. We must guide them down the path of peace. She named each of the beasts in turn, giving them each a single task: protect and guide humanity away from their hate and greed. Make man worthy of the power they will one day bear. She blinked again, and she was still Hage Oromo Otsutsuki, younger now, and before her laid a mighty beast that towered above mountains and wailed with a screech that echoed through her bones and brought fear and pain to her heart. At her side was her brother, and they each cried out as they wrestled the monster's power under control, deep into the seal that Hage Oromo had crafted. "Mother," she thought, "I am sorry. Mother. Mother." Sakura blinked, and she was Kaguya. Before her was a great and mighty tree with branches that reached towards the heavens with still vigor, and its petals gently swayed with the breeze, their pink skin reflecting the light of the sun beyond it. In her hands, she held a large fruit that pulsed and echoed. She had already taken a bite, a sweet, sweet bite that had spread warmth through her fingers and toes and made her feel powerful and strong. She took another bite of the fruit, and then another, not at all afraid of the power beginning to seep into her. The fruit was too delicious, too sweet. Sakura smiled. She was dancing, the nobles of the land twirling around her and vying for her favor, she of the great new magic, she who could summon water with a gesture and breathe fire from her lungs. She was pregnant, twins kicking within her belly, and she glowed with the pride of a new mother who would one day hold her children in her arms and see what gifts they had been blessed with. There was fire around her, fire and death, and those who would take her children, those who would take her and use her for their own twisted, selfish greed. Humanity was the same, humanity was always the same. She looked towards the moon and her eyes bled with power, reflecting her vision upon the world and drawing each of them under her will. There would be peace. There would always be peace. She was goddess and mother and queen, and her sons would be safe. She was betrayed. Her sons stood before her, pulling her power from her, ripping it from her body. "I am sorry, mother." Each of them cried, and she did not understand. How could they not understand? If they set humanity free, the darkness, the misery would overtake the world once again. She screamed in agony for the fate her children would suffer, screamed for the ones she had lost, screamed for the ones that would be lost, screamed for what was to come and what had always been. And then Sakura, the real Sakura, opened her eyes and wept. Check the description for the links to the author.